Lord Eddard Stark stood in the torchlit depths of the Red Keep's dungeons, the damp chill licking at his bones even through his heavy cloak. A single iron sconce illuminated his grave face, casting flickering shadows across his stern features. Deep beneath the seat of the Iron Throne, the weight of duty pressed upon him more heavily than any burden he had ever borne. It was mere hours since he had confronted Queen Cersei Lannister in the gardens, revealing what he knew about her children and their true parentage. He had offered her the chance to flee, to take her brood and disappear rather than face Robert Baratheon's wrath. But the king had perished in a hunting accident before the truth could be made known. Now Joffrey, the boy king he suspected to be Jaime Lannister's son, reigned from the Iron Throne. And worse yet, Ned held that very Jaime Lannister in his custody. Golden-haired, fearless, arrogant Jaime, captured after a skirmish outside the walls. Ned could scarcely believe it himself. Someone so integral to the queen's power, the one man rumored to have fathered her children, was now a prisoner at his mercy. The shock of it had yet to fade. He had interrogated Jaime for hours, seeking answers, wanting to hear the truth from the Kingslayer's own lips. But Jaime had been as slippery with words as with a sword. He spoke in jest, half-lies, weaving a tapestry of riddles. Still, Ned's sense of honor could not abide the duplicity surrounding the royal lineage. If Robert had lived, Ned would have brought the evidence to him. Now the realm stood on the brink of chaos, and King Joffrey's wrath, and that of his mother, was boundless. The only thing that remained consistent in Ned's mind was his duty to justice, to the realm, and to the memory of Robert Baratheon, a man he had once called friend. In front of him loomed the iron bars of a small cell. Within, Jaime Lannister lay sprawled on a rough straw pallet, wrists bound in chains. Even in discomfort, he still wore the cocksure grin that made Ned's blood simmer. Jaime's handsome face was smeared with dirt, his golden hair matted. Yet, a casual, mocking light danced in those green eyes. He looked nothing like the fearsome knight of the Kingsguard, nor like the lethal swordsman who'd cut down men without remorse. He looked more like a cat, caged but still confident, certain that somehow his wits or name would deliver him. "So, Lord Stark," Jaime said quietly, breaking the silence in the dungeon, "are you here to stare at me, or to deliver some grand speech about the honor of House Stark and the treachery of House Lannister?" His voice echoed coldly off the stone walls. "If you're seeking a confession, I've none to give." Ned said nothing. He studied Jaime's face, thinking of how he had found him kneeling over the still body of a mad king all those years ago, sword dripping with crimson. Thinking of how that same sword had nearly taken Ned's life in the streets of King's Landing when their men clashed. He remembered the men Jaime had ordered cut down, Stark men, his men, merely to avenge Tyrion Lannister's capture in the Vale. There was so much blood on Jaime's hands, so many secrets swirling around him. "You have committed treason," Ned said at last, his voice low. "Treason against the crown and murder of my men. For these crimes you stand accused." Jaime's lips curled into that smug grin again, as if he were humored by the formality. "We're all traitors if you spin the story right. The entire game is built on betrayal. The difference is who wins." Ned's hand tightened on the pommel of his sword, a gesture Jaime did not miss. In that moment, Ned Stark, Warden of the North, Lord of Winterfell, faced a choice that would change the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Long had he preached the rule of law, the importance of a fair trial, the integrity that should guide a ruler's hand. Yet Jaime's crimes were manifold, his arrogance unwavering. In Ned's mind, the bigger question lingered. Would sparing Jaime Lannister's life only strengthen the queen and her false heir on the throne? Was the realm better served by removing the Kingslayer for good? He heard the echo of Robert Baratheon's laughter in his memory, saw the old friend who had once charged into battle with him. He saw the realm teetering on the edge of a sword, with the Lannisters controlling the Boy King, the gold of Casterly Rock fueling their ambitions. Honor demanded justice. Treason demanded a penalty. The realm demanded peace. And deep within, Ned had a personal reckoning. Jaime Lannister had broken faith and law countless times. The blood of Stark men stained his blade. Ned turned abruptly, beckoning the guards. "Bring him out," he ordered, his voice calm yet laden with the cold fury of a man who had seen too many betrayals. "We'll conduct this at dawn." His last glimpse of Jaime that night was of a curious, almost startled expression lighting the Kingslayer's eyes. A flicker of fear, perhaps, for the first time. Ned left the torch behind, ascending the stone steps to gather what resolve remained in him. Dawn would bring with it a new day, and he would have to be certain. If he carried this out, there would be no going back. Kingslayer or not, Jaime Lannister was still a son of Tywin, and Tywin Lannister was not a man to suffer blood without taking vengeance. All that night, Ned paced the corridors of the Red Keep, uncertain whether his sword should or should not descend on Jaime's neck. Justice warred with politics within him, but in the final hours before dawn, he set his jaw. He thought of the innocents who would be imperiled by a false king, of how the Lannisters played their sly games while the realm floundered, of how he had once trusted his sense of honor too much. This time, he told himself, he must see it through. Let the chips fall where they may. Let the gods judge. If it sparked a war, so be it. At least the blood spilled would be in pursuit of truth, not the furtherance of a lie. And so, as the first hint of sunrise gilded the clouds, Ned ordered Jaime brought to the courtyard. They gathered in a small, grim assembly, for it was not yet widely known that Ned had captured Jaime in a skirmish on the outskirts of King's Landing. The courtyard stones, still damp with morning dew, glistened as a handful of soldiers formed a semicircle. A couple of Lannister men-at-arms stood in shackles, having been captured alongside Jaime. Outside the walls, city folk began to stir. No official pronouncement had been made, no wide condemnation or fair trial arranged. The events had occurred too quickly. In truth, Ned had not asked for King Joffrey's permission. In his mind, Joffrey was no king. He was an impostor, the seed of Jaime's own blood. Ned did not intend to bring this matter before the usurping boy. Instead, Ned would pass judgment as the man holding Jaime's fate in his hands, for the crimes committed against House Stark and against the rightful King Robert's authority. Jaime was marched forward, chains clanking. Even now, with hands bound, hair disheveled, face grimy, there was a glint of defiance in his stare. His eyes flicked over the small crowd. He caught sight of a few gold-cloaked watchmen who exchanged uncertain glances. Most had not realized that Ned Stark intended to carry out an execution. Perhaps they thought it would be a show of intimidation or a forced confession. Jaime's jaw tightened, but he would not beg. Ned's own heart felt weighted with lead as he drew ice, the Valyrian steel greatsword of House Stark. The broad blade gleamed under the soft morning sun. So many executions in the north had been done with that blade's swift, cold justice under the watchful eyes of the old gods. Now, far from Winterfell, Ned invoked that same solemn duty. With a deep breath, his words rang out, "Jaime Lannister, you have attacked the men of House Stark. You have acted against the wishes of the rightful King Robert Baratheon, and you stand accused of high treason. By my authority as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, I find you guilty." Jaime's shoulders braced. He bared his teeth in something that might have been a grin or a grimace. "You're making a mistake, Stark. You know full well what this will bring." "My father." "Your father is not here," Ned said, his voice colder than the frost of the north. "Should Tywin Lannister have a response, he is free to deliver it in kind." Somewhere, a gull cried, echoing over the battlements. The watchers stood silent. Jaime Lannister knelt only because the guards pushed him down upon his knees. He tried to raise his chin with that arrogance that had always marked him, but now there was a tremor of realization behind his gaze. Words hovered in the air, unspoken. Pleas or curses, no one could be sure, but Jaime remained silent. If he was going to die, he would at least do it with a Lannister's pride. Ned lifted ice. For a brief, timeless moment, he thought of Catelyn, of his children scattered, Sansa and Arya in King's Landing, Bran and Rickon in Winterfell, Robb preparing for war. Then he steeled himself. The blade fell in a graceful, final arc. One sharp scream shattered the morning air. Someone in the crowd, or maybe just the spirit of the world crying out in protest. Blood spattered across the stones as Jaime's head tumbled and the Kingslayer's body slumped forward. Silence. Complete, hollow silence. Ned Stark exhaled, stepping back as the guards retrieved the body, the severed head of the Lannister scion. Some onlookers recoiled in horror, others looked faint, but no man raised a voice to protest. The deed was done. Eddard Stark had crossed the threshold of no return, delivering a sentence of death upon Tywin Lannister's golden son, and in that single stroke had thrown a torch into a powder keg that would soon explode across the realm. In that uneasy hush, Ned's men realized the magnitude of what had happened. The Watchers' gazes were drawn to the blood staining the courtyard, to the shape of Jaime's golden hair, now drenched in crimson. Whatever illusions remained about a peaceful settlement or a quiet hush of the scandal were shattered. War was coming. When the news reached Queen Cersei, her shrieks of outrage rattled the walls. Joffrey screamed for Ned's head, demanded immediate retribution, though he had not the slightest idea how to bring the Stark Lord to heel. The gold cloaks were torn between obeying the newly anointed king and the stern authority of Ned, who had declared that Joffrey was illegitimate but had not yet publicly proven it. For a time, King's Landing teetered in chaos, uncertain who truly held power. Some whispered that Tywin Lannister's armies would soon ride. Others feared for the safety of every Stark in the capital. Ned, after wiping clean the Valyrian steel blade of ice, retreated to his quarters. He spared no sense of triumph. If anything, he felt hollow, uncertain, and weighed down by a sadness that was bone deep. But he had acted in accordance with what he believed was right, no matter how grim. The realm was in precarious balance, and that balance had just been shattered by the force of Jaime's execution. Now, only the gods knew what would happen when Tywin heard of his son's death. When the Raven arrived at Casterly Rock, bearing the tidings of Jaime's fate, the earls and knights at Tywin Lannister's side all saw the Lord of the Rock's face turn ashen. In silence, Tywin read the short, curt message. The parchment fell from his hand. Those present expected an explosion of fury. Instead, Tywin's voice came low and cold, barely above a whisper. "Summon the banners." There was no trembling, no outward show of anguish, just an icy calm. He was a man who had built his reputation on ruthless efficiency, on the uncompromising might of House Lannister. This was the man who had all but destroyed House Rain for daring to defy him. Jaime had been his golden son, heir to the Lannister legacy. The blow cut deeper than steel, and Tywin's response would be measured in blood. Word spread quickly. Armies began to muster. Wagons of supplies rolled out from the forges of Lannisport. War horses were shod and fed. Spearmen, archers, knights, all assembled under the crimson banners of House Lannister. The Lion of the West roared in fury, its jaws poised to snap around the neck of the North. Tywin's cousin, Lord Stafford, took up commands in one flank. The formidable Ser Gregor Clegane was dispatched with free rein to ravage the Riverlands, to draw out the northern forces. If House Stark had spilled Lannister blood, then Lannister steel would spill tenfold. So began a new war that none of the Seven Kingdoms had truly anticipated, overshadowed as they were by the rumors of dragons in the east and of White Walkers beyond the wall. Now the eyes of Westeros turned upon the center of power, King's Landing, and the roads leading north to the Trident. Within the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister's anguish was matched only by her hatred. She had lost her twin, her secret lover, the father of her children. Joffrey raged at the council, smashing goblets, demanding Ned's head. But Ned was not alone. He commanded the loyalty of the Northern Lords, the respect of the Vale, through his wife's ties to House Tully and her sister, Lisa Arryn, and the uncertain watch of the Crown's bureaucracy, who had yet to fully align with the new regime. As though the realm had no true king, the court was paralyzed by the knowledge that a civil war was brewing. None dared provoke Ned Stark directly within the city, not after he had dared to swing the sword that severed Jaime's head. For the moment, he was the man of the hour, the figure who had delivered justice as he saw it, whether rightful or not, and had dared defy the Boy King. Sansa Stark, trapped in the Red Castle, could scarcely comprehend what had happened. She had dreamed of Joffrey as her gallant prince, only to watch his temper simmer into cruelty. She had imagined a courtly life of music and dances, only to see heads roll at her father's command. Her illusions were unraveling like a frayed tapestry. In the corridors, servants whispered that war was at hand. They whispered of Tywin's legions marching to King's Landing, how they would put the city to the torch if the king did not serve them. They whispered that Ned Stark would be dragged through the streets as a traitor to the crown. And in her heart, Sansa did not know what to believe. Arya Stark, more spirited and less naive, did not need rumor to confirm her father's dire straits. She saw the tension in the halls. She heard the hush fall whenever she passed. She felt the stares of Lannister guards who still wandered the keep. She felt the anger radiating from Cersei, from Joffrey. And she saw that her father had come to the capital with good intentions, only to spill the blood of the queen's brother. If Arya was frightened, she did not show it, but a seed of panic thrummed in her chest. She wanted to hold Needle in her hand every moment, to be ready. She missed home, missed the safety of Winterfell, and yearned for news of her brothers. Ned at least saw the danger they all faced. He knew the moment the blow fell that war would come. There was no turning back. Far from letting Joffrey remain on the throne, Ned now felt more urgent than ever to reveal the truth. Robert Baratheon's true heirs, if any existed, might stand a chance if the realm realized the monstrous deception. Yet the lords of the land would see a man who had effectively executed a crowned king's uncle without so much as a trial in front of the Iron Throne. In the minds of many, this was a grave offense, a matter that overshadowed even the question of Joffrey's parentage. Ned dreaded the bloodshed that would follow, but he could not regret what he had done. Perhaps that was the nature of honor, that once you took a stand, there was no recanting it. Meanwhile, ravens flew in every direction. To Winterfell, bearing word of Ned's deed. To Riverrun, where Catelyn's father, Lord Hoster Tully, lay ailing but still commanded a formidable alliance. To the Eyrie, where Lisa Arryn held her young son Lord Robert close, fending off all outside influences. And to the camps of Robb Stark, who had marched south with a host of northern bannermen as soon as he heard his father had been cast into potential danger by the Lannisters. Now the news that Ned Stark had executed Jaime Lannister spread through the northern ranks, stoking both pride and fear. Some said it was a bold stroke that would show the Lannisters the North could not be trifled with. Others worried it would provoke Tywin to monstrous retribution. Robb, just a boy in many eyes, realized he must now lead his men in a full-scale war. Catelyn Stark at Riverrun heard the news from a breathless messenger who arrived on a lathered horse. She read the letter once, twice, and felt her heart plunge into darkness. She loved Ned for the very honor that now drove him to such extremes, but she could not help questioning the wisdom of his actions. She pictured Tywin's retribution sweeping across the Riverlands, her homeland. She pictured the captive Sansa and Arya in King's Landing, as hostages to the Lannisters' wrath. The letter told of no plan for their safety, only that Ned had acted unflinching. Her heart pounded. She had to see him, to speak with him, to ensure that they could salvage their daughters' lives before it was too late. Driven by fear and love, Catelyn conferred with her uncle, Brynden Blackfish Tully, and with the lords loyal to Riverrun. They must gather their forces, fortify the region, and coordinate with the northern host under Robb's command. War was no longer a matter of if, but how soon it would consume them. Still, in the quiet recesses of her mind, Catelyn prayed to the Seven that some thread of reason might avert bloodshed on an unthinkable scale. But she remembered the steel in Ned's voice, and she doubted any compromise was left. Jaime's death demanded vengeance from every proud lion that marched from the west. Far to the west, Tyrion Lannister found himself likewise reeling from the news. He had never shared an easy bond with his siblings, but he loved Jaime in his own way. Jaime was the only one of the family who had shown him kindness, who had defended him from their father's scorn. Hearing of Jaime's execution at Ned Stark's hand cut Tyrion deeply. The imp was at the crossroads inn when the message caught up to him. He had been traveling by roundabout roads, hoping to reunite with his father's forces, to head to Casterly Rock. Now everything changed. Ned Stark had sentenced his brother to death. Tyrion's thoughts spun. How would Tywin respond? Surely with war. Could he counsel caution? Likely not. Could he avenge Jaime himself? Tyrion had no illusions of besting Ned Stark in single combat. The only sword Tyrion wielded skillfully was his wit. But that might not be enough in a war fueled by heartbreak and Lannister gold. He tossed the Raven's letter onto the inn's table, drained a cup of ale with shaking hands. His mismatched eyes glinted with tears he refused to shed. Jaime was gone, the man he had idolized in childhood, the only shining star in the gloom of House Lannister's politics. Tyrion now carried that burden of vengeance, whether he wanted it or not. The realm had changed in a heartbeat. Winter was not just coming, war was. In King's Landing, the climate grew increasingly tense by the hour. Queen Cersei made a show of calling small council meetings, but each devolved into accusations and demands. Grand Maester Pycelle tried to calm the storm by advising measured response. Varys wrung his hands and spouted cryptic suggestions of cunning and subterfuge. Peter Baelish measured opportunity in each shift of power. But Cersei would not be mollified. Her heartbreak had turned to an icy fury. Her beloved Jaime was gone, cut down by Ned Stark, and she would not rest until House Stark was destroyed root and stem. King Joffrey, for his part, demanded Ned Stark's head on a spike, the ruin of Winterfell, the utter annihilation of the North. But he lacked the cunning or discipline to orchestrate such a campaign. He began ordering the Gold Cloaks to arrest Stark men in the city, to harass them, to show them who was in charge. And the Gold Cloaks, uncertain whom to obey, carried out some half measures. Robb's vanguard, approaching from the Riverlands, threatened to cut off any attempt Cersei might make to punish the Starks in King's Landing. The tension thickened. If a single spark were to land in that powder keg, the entire city might go up in flames. Meanwhile, Ned endured sleepless nights. He kept watch over his daughters as best he could, stationing loyal men near them. He read every Raven's message that came from outside, bracing himself for news of Tywin Lannister's approach. The days melted into a blur of urgent gatherings, heated arguments in corridors, back-channel negotiations. Men shouted that Ned had no authority to kill a member of the Kingsguard without the king's seal. Ned retorted that Joffrey was not the king, that Robert was the rightful king, but Robert was dead. Around and around the argument went. Yet no one had forcibly come to arrest him, perhaps because the city itself would have erupted if any tried. Many guards still respected the memory of Robert Baratheon, whose friend Ned Stark had been. Others were simply reluctant to wade into a confrontation that might end in a bloodbath within the Red Keep's halls. And so, for a time, there was a stalemate, an uneasy quiet before the tempest. It was broken when the first outriders sighted a large Lannister force crossing the borders of the Riverlands. The infamous mountain that rides Gregor Clegane led the vanguard. Villages were torched, peasants put to the sword, fields ravaged. Smoke rose in tall columns to the sky. Lord Tywin Lannister had not marched in secret. He wanted the realm to see his retribution. He wanted the Tullys and the Starks and anyone else who might have illusions of defying House Lannister to quiver in fear. Desperate ravens converged on the Red Keep, telling of fresh atrocities each day. Lord Tywin's main host followed closely behind the mountain's outriders, and the number of knights in his train was rumored to be in the tens of thousands, though no one could confirm. The Riverlords looked to Riverrun for leadership. Catelyn, uncertain, turned to Robb, who had just arrived at Riverrun with his northern host. Their combined forces might hold back the Lannisters, if commanded wisely. But Tywin's cunning was legendary, his wealth inexhaustible, and his thirst for vengeance unstoppable. Robb Stark, though young, demonstrated a quiet poise. He called his banners, forging alliances with any who had grievances against the Lannisters. House Frey, House Mallister, House Blackwood. Some were reluctant, but none could ignore that the next target of the Lannister wrath might be their own strongholds. Even Walder Frey, notoriously slippery, entertained the notion of aiding the young Stark if certain conditions were met. Catelyn had no choice but to support her son in these negotiations, even as she worried for her daughters. She wanted them away from King's Landing, safe from Joffrey's cruelty. But the roads were no longer safe, and Joffrey would not let go of such precious hostages. Word eventually reached Ned that Tywin's armies were on the move. Every corner of the city buzzed with talk of war. Ned assembled his loyal men, preparing to ride out and join Robb. But the Red Keep was a labyrinth of potential dangers. He had to be sure that if he left, Sansa and Arya would not be seized. The day he made his decision to withdraw from King's Landing, to ride north and join the war, the trap was sprung. A band of gold cloaks, urged on by Cersei's threats and bribes, attempted to block Ned's departure. Swords were drawn in the castle courtyard. Joffrey, perched on a balcony, shrieked down at them, demanding Ned Stark's immediate arrest. The Boy King's voice cracked with fury. "Seize him," Joffrey bellowed. "Seize the traitor who murdered my uncle." The gold cloaks advanced, but Ned's men, grim-faced and determined, formed a shield around their lord. A hush fell over the yard. From the shadows emerged the Hound, Sandor Clegane, sworn shield to Joffrey. He stood there, tall and menacing, his burned face twisted with tension. Did he want to cross swords with Ned Stark's men? Possibly not. But he had pledged loyalty to Joffrey, and that oath weighed on him. The air crackled with the threat of violence. Ned looked up to Joffrey. "You have no right to call yourself king," he said, voice echoing sharply against the stone. "Your father was Robert Baratheon, and you are not his son." A collective gasp spread through the onlookers. It was the first time Ned had openly made the accusation in front of so many. Cersei, behind Joffrey, turned pale with fury. The truth was out, or at least a dire rumor that might tear the realm asunder. "You lie!" Joffrey screeched, face turning red. "Guards, kill them! Kill them all!" Swords clashed. The courtyard erupted into chaos. Ned, with a heavy heart, raised his voice, bellowing to his men to fight only if they must, to minimize bloodshed. But the gold cloaks, spurred by Joffrey's shrill demands, lunged forward. The clash was brutal, short, and decisive. Ned's men were seasoned northerners, loyal to the last. Steel rang on steel. A few of Ned's men fell, but the gold cloaks were not an army, merely a city watch. They could not stand long against men who had trained their whole lives in the harsh north. Within moments, several gold cloaks lay on the ground, moaning or motionless. The rest broke and fled. Sandor Clegane watched from the side, blade in hand but not fully engaged. He stared at the carnage with dark, brooding eyes. A moment came when he might have stepped forward to challenge Ned directly. Instead, he turned away, leaving Joffrey's frantic demands unanswered. The Boy King nearly lost himself in fury, screaming obscenities. But he was powerless to force the Hound to do anything. The rest of the gold cloaks had scattered. Ned and his surviving men moved out, heading for the stables where they had fresh horses. Cersei rushed to Joffrey's side, her face twisted in rage. But Ned was already mounting, spurring his horse through the castle gates. He had arranged for a small escort to spirit Sansa and Arya away in the confusion. If he could get them beyond the city walls, they might ride hard for the north or east, away from the Lannisters' immediate grasp. The plan was risky, but in this chaotic moment it might succeed. Cersei shrieked after them, hurling curses. This was no longer just a matter of the throne. This was deeply personal. Her twin's murderer had just spat in her face and fled, taking her future daughter-in-law with him. Ned and his party galloped through the streets, which cleared fast as people saw armed men riding with grim intent. They passed through the city gates, helped by an old guard officer who still remembered Robert's respect for Ned. Once beyond the city walls, they spurred their horses, driving them relentlessly. They could not afford a measured pace. They must meet Robb's forces as soon as possible or risk being harried by Lannister outriders. During that breathless flight, Ned found himself torn between relief and dread. He had rescued Sansa and Arya from King's Landing for the moment, but their journey was perilous. And behind them, the city lay in turmoil under a king with a shaky claim, manipulated by a queen thirsting for vengeance. Ahead of them, the roads led to battlefields ravaged by the lions of the West. The realm was unraveling like a tapestry. In the following weeks, the war escalated on multiple fronts. Robb Stark's host maneuvered deftly in the Riverlands, attempting to cut off the mountain's atrocities. Tywin Lannister's main army pressed toward Riverrun, systematically burning villages and farmland, taking castle after castle. The Tully Bannermen fought valiantly, but found themselves outnumbered. Robb had success in small skirmishes, capturing a few forward Lannister scouts, but the real test was yet to come. The howling call for vengeance over Jaime Lannister's death had turned Tywin's determination into a blade aimed straight at House Stark's heart. Finally, father and son were reunited at Riverrun. The meeting of Ned and Robb was bittersweet. Their forces combined, but the toll was obvious. They had lost men, lost friends. The Riverlands was awash in chaos. And at the War Council, Ned saw how his boy, barely more than a youth, had taken up the mantle of leadership, forced to make decisions that men twice his age would hesitate over. That night, in the flickering light of a war tent, they pored over maps of the Trident, the roads and fords, the fortress of Harrenhal, and the route Tywin's armies might take. They had to guess at Tywin's next move. Catelyn watched them from the tent's edge, her eyes glistening with worry. She said little, but her gaze lingered on the pair, husband and son, united in a cause that would drown the realm in blood. She understood Ned's reasons, even as she feared the consequences. How many mothers would lose children in this war? How many men would fall in service to lords who claimed justice or vengeance? Some nights, Ned could scarcely sleep, haunted by visions of Jaime's severed head. Though he believed he had done the honorable thing, he felt no triumph. Death was never glorious, but he had no time to dwell on regrets. The Lannisters advanced, and unless the North and Riverlands united, they would be devoured. Riverrun itself was threatened by a siege. Walder Frey's alliance was uncertain. He had lent them passage across the Twins under certain conditions, most notably a proposed betrothal for Robb, that had yet to be fulfilled, and Walder Frey's patience was notoriously short. Ned realized this war would be fought as much with alliances and negotiations as with swords. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister moved like a predator circling wounded prey. His intelligence network kept him informed of the size and movement of Stark and Tully forces. He knew Ned Stark was now with Robb, that Sansa and Arya had escaped the capital, and that they were determined to unify the region. Tywin's generals urged caution, but Tywin was determined to crush the Stark host decisively. In private, Tywin wrestled with his grief and his rage. Jaime's death had wounded him more than any insult to House Lannister's name. He would not rest until Ned Stark was in chains or dead. The first major engagement took place near the Green Fork of the Trident. Scouts for Robb Stark reported a sizable Lannister force under Ser Gregor Clegane approaching from the west, with the potential to link up with Tywin's main host from the south. Robb made a bold decision to split his forces, using a smaller contingent as bait to draw out the mountain. Ned approved, though it worried him to rely on such cunning. He had taught Robb to fight with honor face to face, but the times demanded craft and strategy. War was not a tourney. Robb led the smaller force personally, luring Gregor's men into a narrow crossing. The mountain, never one to shy from a fight, charged in. The savage melee that followed was swift and bloody. Northern archers rained death on the Lannisters from hidden positions. Gregor's men buckled, pressed by ferocious direwolf banners that sprang from the surrounding woods. Gregor himself fought like a demon, cutting down several men, but was forced to retreat when an arrow lodged in his side. As the remainder of his troops broke, Robb signaled the horns to press the attack. The North tasted victory that day, sending the mountain limping away into the Riverlands. Yet the cost was high. Bodies littered the fields by the Trident, countless families left grieving. Ned walked among the fallen afterward, grim-faced, offering quiet prayers. Many of the dead were Lannister soldiers who had never personally wronged him. War devoured the innocent as well as the guilty. Yet the Knights of the West had marched on the Riverlands at Tywin's command, and war gave no quarter. News of the victory spread quickly. Bards began to sing praises of the young wolf, Robb Stark, who had outmaneuvered the infamous Gregor Clegane. Morale soared among the northern host and the river lords. Ned saw his son coming into his own as a commander. But victory would be fleeting if Tywin's main army closed in. Already, outriders reported that Tywin's columns were on the march, a rolling wave of steel and mounted knights. They would overshadow Gregor's force many times over. Amid these swirling uncertainties, a raven arrived with a message from King's Landing, or rather, from the newly convened small council that served Joffrey. The letter was dripping with royal condemnation, demanding that Ned Stark and his rebellious son lay down arms at once and present themselves to the king for judgment. It threatened the heads of Sansa and Arya if they refused. Catelyn read that passage with trembling fingers, tears in her eyes. Ned's knuckles went white with anger. So Joffrey had discovered that they had spirited the girls away. There had been rumors that Sansa and Arya traveled with their father, but Joffrey's letter insisted they remained hostage. Was it a bluff? Ned had whisked his daughters out of the city, but were they truly safe? And if they reached the wrong ears, might Cersei find a way to capture them? The letter sowed uncertainty like a poisoned barb. Ned had to reassure Catelyn that Sansa and Arya were safely hidden under the protection of loyal bannermen. But he knew how precarious that was. If any Lannister outriders intercepted them, if any of Walder Frey's brood decided to betray the Starks for a better bargain with Tywin, the unthinkable could happen. The tension frayed Ned's composure. He forced himself to focus on the war at hand. If they could defeat Tywin in the field, the realm might see that Joffrey's throne was a farce. Then perhaps the great houses might unite to place Stannis Baratheon, Robert's true brother and heir, on the Iron Throne. Ned did not want that power for himself. All he wanted was justice, to see the realm set right. But first, Tywin's war machine had to be confronted. Battle after skirmish after battle lit the Riverlands ablaze. Castles that had stood for centuries found themselves besieged. Smoke on the horizon became a daily sight. Refugees clogged the roads, seeking shelter wherever they could. Even in the north, the fear of Lannister reprisal was palpable. At Winterfell, Bran and Rickon Stark heard whispered stories of war, though they were too young to fully understand. Maester Luwin tried to maintain order, but supply lines were stretched, and concerns over an Ironborn incursion along the coast complicated matters further. War did not isolate itself neatly to a single front. It invited opportunists. The realm had not been so close to fracturing since Robert's rebellion. Then came the confrontation that defined the campaign. Robb and Ned positioned their combined forces near the Red Fork, hoping to intercept Tywin's main army before it reached Riverrun. The day dawned gray and misty. The ground was sodden from recent rains, complicating cavalry maneuvers. Scouts reported Tywin's vanguard approaching in disciplined columns. War horns sounded in the distance, a low, ominous note that made every soldier's heart pound. Ned rode forward with Robb, flanked by bannermen from the north and the Riverlands. He saw his old friend Roose Bolton in his pale armor, the great Jon Umber bellowing war cries, the Blackfish Brynden Tully scanning the horizon with hawk-like eyes. Thousands of men arranged themselves in lines, pikes bristling, archers at the ready. Drums pounded in time with the heartbeat of the army. Ned remembered the last time he had faced a Lannister army, in Robert's rebellion, and how Robert's might had carried the day. Now Robert was gone, and Ned stood against the Lannisters once again, this time with no unstoppable friend at his side. The horns sounded again. Tywin's banners emerged from the fog, a sea of crimson cloth bearing the Golden Lion. Knights in gleaming plate marched forward, cavalry behind them. It was a fearsome display of wealth and power. Ned could almost see Tywin, stern and pitiless, near the center of the host. He pictured Jaime's face for a moment, remembering the flicker of life that had once danced in those mocking green eyes. Now that life was snuffed out, and Tywin was here to exact his pound of flesh. With a bellowing cheer, the Stark cavalry charged from the flanks, attempting to envelop Tywin's wings. Arrows rained from archers posted in hidden vantage points. The Lannisters answered with disciplined ranks of crossbowmen and countercharges of heavy horse. The battlefield erupted into a frenzy of shouting men, clashing steel, rearing horses. The mud churned underfoot, making it treacherous to maintain formation. Many a valiant knight slid and tumbled into the muck, only to be trampled by the next wave. Spears splintered, swords hacked through flesh. Robb's wolf banner soared near the front, and the men rallied around him. The young wolf displayed uncanny bravery, leading from where the fighting was thickest. Ned, though older, fought beside him, trying to keep his son in sight. Blood spattered Ice's Valyrian steel as Ned cut down a mounted Lannister knight who charged him with a lance. The clash was swift, brutal, leaving Ned's arm aching from the impact. He forced himself to keep going, heart pounding, limbs heavy with adrenaline and fear. Somewhere amidst the chaos, roars of Casterly Rock thundered as Lannister men pressed forward. The lines rippled, bent. Ned rallied what forces he could, calling for discipline. Step by step, the northern foot soldiers braced their shields, locked in formation with pikes thrusting forward. Lannister knights battered at them, but the line held. On the left flank, the Tully forces were faring worse, slowly pushed back by the weight of Tywin's main cavalry. Arrows filled the sky in deadly arcs, picking off men on both sides. The sound of steel on steel, horses screaming, men shouting in agony. It was a symphony of despair. In that swirl of chaos, Ned glimpsed Tywin Lannister himself, clad in resplendent plate chased with gold, riding a warhorse the color of night. Tywin's face was stern, emotionless. This was personal, yet he refused to let it override his discipline. He directed his captains with curt orders, shaping the flow of the battle like a master tactician. Ned realized that Tywin was trying to split the Stark Tully forces, isolate pockets, and then crush them. They had to act swiftly or risk defeat. Robb saw it too. He signaled the Greyjohn's heavy infantry to pivot, reinforcing the threatened flank. Lord Umber, roaring oaths, led his men in a thunderous countercharge. It blunted the Lannister push for a moment, a savage collision of steel that sent men sprawling. Ned saw an opening then, a chance to wheel the cavalry around and strike at the Lannister center, perhaps forcing Tywin into retreat. He shouted for Bolton and the Dreadfort men to reinforce the lines, and led his riders in a sweeping motion around a cluster of fighting. What followed was chaos upon chaos, but the gamble began to pay off. Tywin's center found itself threatened by multiple angles. If they could force Tywin to retreat or capture him outright, the battle might end decisively. Ned urged, his horse forward, ignoring the ache in his sword arm. He pressed through a sea of Lannister banners. Over the din of war, he heard men cursing, screaming, praying. The smell of blood and sweat was everywhere. He glimpsed Tywin only yards away, cutting down a Stark soldier with precise efficiency. For a moment, Tywin's icy green gaze met Ned's. Two patriarchs, two fearsome lords, crossing swords in the thick of war. Tywin's voice rose in a cold snarl, and he spurred his horse toward Ned. Their blades met in a shower of sparks, Valyrian steel against castle-forged steel. The impact jarred Ned to the bone. Tywin was older, but strong and relentless. The clang of metal rang in Ned's ears as they exchanged blow for blow. Both men were tired, hearts burning with the cause that fueled them. Tywin's hatred for the man who killed his golden son, Ned's determination to protect his family and the realm from Lannister dominion. Around them, the battle shifted, men swirling in close-quarters fights. In that deadly dance, Tywin found an opening. His sword grazed Ned's left side, slicing through leather and mail. Pain flared, and Ned fought through it, driving ice upward in a desperate parry. Tywin reeled, barely avoiding a fatal thrust. Then another wave of cavalry crashed between them, forcing them apart. Ned's horse was jostled, and he clung to the saddle, vision blurring. The pain in his side flared hotter. He struggled to keep his seat, to rejoin the fight. He could not see Tywin anymore, only the swirl of battle. Men pressed all around. If the Lannister lines reformed, the advantage might swing against the north. Ned pressed forward with what remained of his cavalry, rallying them into a wedge that smashed into the partial flank of Tywin's center. The maneuver caused confusion among the Lannisters. For a few precious moments, they faltered. Robb seized the opportunity, ordering a full surge of the Tully infantry. The battlefield erupted with a final crescendo of violence. Lannister men began to break and flee, others fought to the last. Tywin, seeing his lines buckle, called a retreat, signaling his horns to pull back. As quickly as it had begun, it was over. The battered remnants of Tywin's army withdrew in good order, not a headlong rout but a measured fallback to a safer position. Ned, dismounted at last, sank to one knee in the mud, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. The ground was strewn with the dead and dying, hundreds from both sides. He lifted his head to see Robb approaching, face streaked with grime, eyes wide with adrenaline. They had won the field, but at great cost. Tywin Lannister lived, and he would regroup. This was not the end of the war. Still, in the immediate aftermath, the Stark-Tully alliance claimed victory. Trumpets sounded. Men cheered raggedly. Catelyn rushed onto the field with Maester Aed to see to Ned's wound. He winced as they bound him, but let them do their work. All around, wounded men groaned, corpses lay twisted. War was as brutal as he remembered. The days that followed were a blur of triage, funerals, negotiations with captured knights. A few highborn Lannisters were taken prisoner. The Tully lords argued about how best to press their advantage. Robb believed they should pursue Tywin's retreating host before it regrouped. Others believed they should secure their supply lines and nurse their wounded first. Ned, recovering from his gash, still took part in council. He reminded them that Tywin's retribution had only begun, that King's Landing was still in Lannister control, that Joffrey still wore the crown. If they delayed, they might find themselves fighting not just Tywin's regrouped army but new reinforcements from the west. Yet war is seldom decided by a single battle. Over the next weeks, further skirmishes erupted. Robb gained new allies, while Tywin enforced loyalty by threats and gold. The Riverlands became a chessboard of maneuvers, each side seeking a decisive blow. Grief weighed on Ned's heart daily. He had begun this, in a sense, by cleaving Jaime's head from his shoulders. He had acted for honor, for justice, for the safety of the realm, but the realm was soaked in blood because of it. If it ended in victory and a return to rightful rule, perhaps it would have been worth it. If it only birthed unending carnage, Ned could scarcely bear the cost. Word trickled in from distant corners of Westeros. In the Vale, Lysa Arryn refused to commit troops, calling it a war for the crows. In the north, the Greyjoys eyed their chance to raid. Across the sea, rumors of a Targaryen girl with dragons circulated. The realm was fracturing, spinning out of control, each region pursuing its own advantage in the power vacuum. Ned realized that Robert Baratheon's old alliance had evaporated the moment the king died. Now the Seven Kingdoms were truly seven again, and no one recognized Joffrey as rightful king, except for those who feared the Lannisters or coveted their gold. In this swirling storm, the voice of reason was drowned out by calls for vengeance and survival. And so the war of the lion and the wolf consumed the hearts and minds of lords and small folk alike. As months dragged on, pitched battles gave way to brutal raids, scorched earth tactics, and a siege at Harrenhal where Tywin holed up with a large portion of his forces. Robb attempted to starve them out, though the fortress's sprawling size and rumored curses complicated the siege. Ned joined him there, mustering men to seal off supply lines. Occasionally, Tywin's outriders would sally forth, trying to break the encirclement. Clashes erupted at the gates, and the banners of Lannister and Stark fluttered over fields soaked with the blood of nameless men. Ned had never imagined that his one blow of execution might unleash such a tide. But it had, and now he had to see it through. He wrote countless letters to the major houses, urging them to see the truth about Joffrey's parentage, to ally against the Lannisters who grasped at power through fear and coin. Some houses responded favorably, appalled by the cruelty inflicted on the Riverlands. Others held back, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. War is rarely a clean affair, Ned realized. Diplomacy was as important as the sword, if not more so. And all the while, ravens from King's Landing carried news of further chaos. Cersei struggled to maintain control, conspiracies thrived, and the city's hungry masses grew restless. In the hush before another storm, Ned found a moment's respite. He stood atop a rise near Harrenhal, gazing out at the sunrise over war-torn fields. His side still ached, but he wore his armor lightly now, helm in the crook of his arm. The morning light reminded him of Winterfell, of a simpler life. He breathed in the crisp air, though the faint smell of ash still lingered. For an instant, he allowed his mind to wander back to a time when he was just Eddard, the boy who followed his brother Brandon, who dreamed of being a knight. That life was gone. He was Lord Stark, father, husband, a man who had struck down Jaime Lannister to uphold the truth. The realm was paying the price, but was there another way? If he had done nothing, if he had let Jaime live, the lie would have continued, and Joffrey would still command the throne in Robert's name. Perhaps the realm would have known peace for a time, but it would have been built on a false foundation. Ned's sense of honor could not abide it. He sighed, turning when he heard footsteps behind him. It was Robb, his posture now reminiscent of a young lord who had seen too many horrors in too short a time. Robb's eyes bore a quiet resolve. He reported that their scouts had spotted movement within Harrenhal, signs the Lannisters might attempt a breakout under cover of darkness, or perhaps an evacuation. War had taught Robb caution. They needed to be ready for any trick Tywin might pull. Ned nodded. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling a fierce surge of paternal pride and sorrow. Here was his child, forced into the crucible of war, forging an identity as a leader far beyond his years. "We stand together," Ned said softly, gazing at the battered field below. "And we see this through, for the sake of our family, and for the sake of the realm." Robb nodded, though a flicker of doubt crossed his expression. "Do you think we can still save the realm, father?" he asked quietly. "After all the blood, all the vengeance?" Ned had no easy answer. He shook his head, feeling the weight of everything upon him. "We can only do what we believe is right. If we fail to try, then we've given up our honor entirely." And so, father and son turned their backs on the sunrise and returned to the encampment. They had battles to plan, supply lines to organize, alliances to maintain. The future was fraught with uncertainty and tragedy. But the name of Eddard Stark, the man who took Jaime Lannister's head, would forever be etched into the annals of Westeros. Some would call him a righteous man of honor, others a reckless fool who unleashed a savage war. History would decide in time. For now, war raged on and the kingdom bled. The cost of honor was steep, yet Ned Stark could see no other path, no compromise that would restore truth without plunging a knife into falsehood's heart. War burned through the Riverlands like a fever, unstoppable in its spread. Could one stroke of a sword have ignited the entire conflagration? Many historians would later say so, pointing to Ned Stark's execution of the Kingslayer as the catalyst for the War of the Lion and the Wolf, a war that would span the length and breadth of Westeros, toppling lords and crowning new kings. Yet for Ned, the real battlefield was within himself, each dawn forcing him to question if he had done right or if the realm would have been better served by mercy. The old gods were silent, the new gods as distant as the stars. Only the howling wind across the fields of the dead seemed to answer him. And still, he pressed on, forging alliances, commanding armies, hoping that if they could shatter Tywin's power, the realm might unite behind a true Baratheon or at least a rightful king. Each step was a gamble, each moment a new test. Sansa and Arya lay constantly in his thoughts, reminders of what he fought for. He had to build a safer tomorrow, even if the present day was drenched in blood. So the drums of war beat on, drawing men from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms into a conflict that dwarfed all imagination. The hammered steel of swords clashing, the thunder of war horses, the smoke of burning fields, these became the new normal. Some said the gods wept, but it changed nothing. Everyone chose a side or had a side chosen for them. The Game of Thrones, as men called it, took no prisoners in the end, for even survivors were forever scarred. In the midst of that vast struggle, Lord Eddard Stark would remain a figure of grim resolve, riding at the head of the northern host with the memory of a single, defining execution carved into his soul. The war had many battles yet to be fought, many betrayals and alliances yet to unfold. It might rage for seasons before peace was found, if it ever was. But the pivot upon which it turned, the blow that set the lion upon the wolf in earnest, was that bright morning in the courtyard of the Red Keep, when ice fell and Jaime Lannister's blood stained the stones. Men might argue for generations whether Ned Stark did right or wrong. The truth was that he did as his conscience demanded, and all the realm paid the price. Such was the nature of honor in Westeros, a harsh mistress, unforgiving and unyielding. Through blood and steel, the wheel turned anew, forging a tragedy that would be recounted long after the snows of winter had melted into the seas of time. Yet for Ned Stark there could be no turning back. His duty, as he saw it, was to protect the realm from a lie, no matter the cost, no matter the rivers of blood that were now unleashed to roar across the land. So the war raged, and the Seven Kingdoms would never again be the same. The war drums thundered long into the night beneath the cursed walls of Harrenhal. In the bleak courtyard of that blackened fortress, fires sputtered and spat shadows against the rain-slick stone. Lord Eddard Stark moved among the tents of the Stark Tully host, his breath steaming in the autumn chill. His hand rested at times on his bandaged left side, where the sword of Tywin Lannister had laid open flesh during the Battle of the Red Fork. The wound was healing but still burned fiercely if he twisted the wrong way. A constant reminder of the enemies he had made, and the brother he had slain for them. The memory of ice cleaving through Jaime Lannister's neck haunted Ned's dreams, though it was not regret that gnawed at him. Rather, it was the knowledge of what that act had unleashed across the realm. He pressed on, because there was no returning to a time before he had delivered the sentence and swung the sword. By one of the larger tents, his son Robb stood in the dull glow of lantern light, conferring with his bannermen. Rain slicked the boy's auburn hair to his brow, and streaks of fatigue and mud marred the lines of his lean, beardless face. Yet there was a resolute air about him, a quiet gravity beyond his years. The lords who had once assumed that the young wolf was too green for warfare now spoke in subdued tones, deferring to his judgment. He had surprised them all with cunning maneuvers and a cool head under pressure, forging a reputation in the slaughter by the Trident. Ned approached to catch the end of Robb's strategy session. The great John Umber, towering and boisterous even when weary, was stamping his feet to keep warm as he said, "We've bloodied the lion, that much is true. But Tywin won't stay holed up in Harrenhal forever. He's no craven. The moment his scouts find a gap, he'll break free, and I'll wager he'll be savage for another fight. The man's lost his golden son. A wounded lion's the most dangerous of beasts." Roose Bolton, expression as pale and inscrutable as the moon, inclined his head. "Lord Tywin's men are disciplined. Ser Gregor's outriders remain a constant threat, harrying our supply lines. If we attempt to starve him out here, he might starve us out in return. This land has been pillaged to the bone already." Robb's gaze flickered to the rain-soaked fields beyond the tent. "I understand the risk, but if we allow Tywin to move at his leisure, we'll lose the advantage. His retreat after the Red Fork wasn't a rout. We forced him back, but he kept enough order to preserve a strong core of knights and crossbowmen. If we let him slip free, he could pivot south and march on Riverrun or cross the Trident to threaten the north. Worse, he might decide to ride for King's Landing and fortify the Queen's seat." Robb's voice remained calm, but in the gentle lamplight Ned saw the spark of iron in his eyes. "So we hold fast. We keep our net cast around Harrenhal. Any foray he attempts, we harass. If the Lannisters break forth, they'll pay dearly for every mile. Winter is coming, and these fields will not soon yield fresh crops." The great John nodded in fierce approval. "Let them eat their gold in that blasted castle if they must." Bolton's lips twitched slightly. "Then we trust the cold and the black walls to do our work for us." "Very well." His gaze wandered toward Ned. "My Lord Stark," he added in that cool, polite tone. "We were just settling the matter of watch rotations. Your thoughts?" Ned raised a hand as if to decline. "My son knows the shape of this war as well as any man, Lord Bolton. I won't gainsay the commander of this host. I've already shared my mind on how best to seal off Harrenhal's northern roads." Bolton dipped his head. "As you will." The great John clapped Robb on the shoulder, making the boy stagger briefly. "Aye, the young wolf will see us through. Tywin's dealing with real northern grit now." With that, the man let out a hearty laugh and trudged off to address his own men. Bolton followed, quieter, slipping into the darkness with the hush of a wraith. Other lords dissipated by twos and threes, leaving Ned and Robb in the hush of the watchfires. For a moment, father and son regarded each other. The war had honed Robb's features, deepened the lines of responsibility in his face, but it had also put new weight on Ned's shoulders. He wanted nothing more than to protect this boy from the horrors of conflict, yet Robb was leading men to their deaths daily. The realm's needs demanded it, and House Stark's survival, too. Robb broke the silence. "I haven't asked, but how fares your side?" Ned shifted his stance. "It weeps if I move too quickly, but Maester Medric is optimistic. I'll live. Next time, I'll try not to trade blows with Tywin Lannister himself." He allowed a ghost of a smile, though neither of them truly felt humor in that moment. Robb tugged off one of his gloves. His hand was raw with calluses. "I wish the confrontation had come to a cleaner end. If you had cut down Tywin, father, or if we'd captured him, the war might be done. Or close to done." "Aye," Ned said quietly, "but battles rarely go as planned, and Tywin Lannister is a formidable man. If the gods willed him to live, perhaps it means we have more trials ahead." Robb nodded and looked away, toward Harrenhal's looming walls. Lightning flickered far off in the sky, outlining the melted towers that had once been the grandest of all strongholds in Westeros. Now it was a tomb of curses and ash. "We'll hold him here as best we can," Robb said. "Let him spend the winter in that ruin if it comes to that." Ned put a hand on Robb's shoulder. "Get some rest, son. We'll plan further in the morning." Robb tried to smile, but exhaustion tugged at his features. "I will, father," he said, though Ned suspected he would spend half the night bent over maps, as he'd done every night since the war began. That was how it was. Command was a lonely burden, filled with sleepless hours. Ned left him there and made his way back to his own tent, boots squelching in mud. Thoughts swirled as he passed guard posts, men standing watch with steaming cloaks. The realm was fracturing. They had tried to rally support for the notion that Joffrey was illegitimate, that Stannis Baratheon was Robert's true heir, but the Lannisters held King's Landing, and fear or gold silenced half the lords of the Reach and the Stormlands. Word was that Renly Baratheon had seized the seat at Storm's End for himself and might soon style himself king. Meanwhile, Stannis brooded at Dragonstone, mustering ships. At least that was the rumor carried by the last ravens. If the Baratheons warred among themselves, it would only deepen the chaos. And across the sea, there were whispers of the Targaryen girl, Daenerys, who might have dragons. The realm had enough nightmares without adding fire-breathing beasts to the mix, yet rumor was a persistent wind. So far, those were distant problems. Ned's war was here, in the Riverlands, with Tywin Lannister and the memory of Jaime's severed head. In his tent, Ned sank onto a low stool and let out a deep breath. The pain in his side flared. Near the corner, Arya Stark dozed on a pallet of straw, arms folded beneath her head. She had refused to remain behind lines. After they had fled King's Landing, Ned had his horse forward, ignoring the ache in his sword arm. He pressed through a sea of Lannister banners. Over the din of war, he heard men cursing, screaming, praying. The smell of blood and sweat was everywhere. He glimpsed Tywin only yards away, cutting down a Stark soldier with precise efficiency. For a moment, Tywin's icy green gaze met Ned's. Two patriarchs. He had let it grow out slightly. Sansa, by contrast, was in a safer camp to the rear, tended by Catelyn's retinue. Ned sometimes felt as though his daughters were worlds apart, shaped differently by the nightmares they had seen. He let Arya sleep. Her exhaustion was evident. She had spent the day scurrying about camp, determined to learn proper sword moves from any soldier who would humor her. In truth, most men simply gave her pointed sticks or wooden swords and let her imitate their drills. But she was relentless, fierce, and more adept than many realized. Ned saw lioness spirit in her sometimes, that hungry flame that would not be tamed. It worried him. War was no place for children, but they were living in a time without mercy. It was late when Caitlin arrived, quietly parting the tent flap. She gave a faint smile upon seeing Arya curled up. Her own face was drawn with fatigue. "The maester's been looking for you," she whispered. "He has fresh bandages." Ned nodded. "I'll see him soon." He rose, wincing as he did, and embraced his wife. She lingered in his arms, tension in her posture. He knew how heavily all this weighed on her. Her father, Lord Hoster Tully, was old and sick in Riverrun. Their homeland was ravaged by war, and both her husband and son were in peril daily. "Any news from the scouts?" he asked quietly. She drew back, pressing her lips together. "More sightings of Lannister outriders near the western edges. Gregor Clegane moves like a phantom, burning outlying farms. Our men are stretched too thin to chase him down unless we pull from the siege lines. And there's talk that Tywin's receiving supplies from somewhere south. Possibly a hidden route or smugglers." Ned's jaw tightened. "We have to cut those lines if we can. If Tywin is resupplied, he may outlast us here." Caitlin nodded grimly. "I'll speak with the lords in the morning. If they can sweep the roads more aggressively, we might corner these smugglers. But it won't be easy. The Riverlands are large, and we have no guaranteed safe route ourselves." A hush fell between them, punctured by the soft snores of Arya. Caitlin lowered her voice further. "I wish there were a way to end this without more bloodshed. Part of me prays that Tywin will see the futility of it. But I know that is hopeless. He'll never yield after losing Jaime. Not to us." Ned swallowed. "He'll fight to the last. The Lannisters have never been known for half measures. And if we yield, if we let him slip away unpunished, the realm remains in the hands of a false king. I can't let that lie remain. Robert deserved better." Caitlin closed her eyes briefly. "I know. I just pray the gods guide us through. For the sake of our children." She left him then to fetch the maester, and Ned sat in near darkness, letting the burden of command, of fatherhood, and of guilt settle on him like a heavy cloak. He had done what he believed was honorable, but each day's carnage weighed more heavily on his conscience. In the silence, he thought back to earlier days at Winterfell, the taste of cold northern wind, the crackle of a hearth in the great hall. Felt like a distant dream. He was still lost in reverie when Maester Medric arrived to change the bandages. Arya stirred awake, blinking blearily, but Ned assured her all was well. She dozed off again once the maester finished his work. Then, with a sigh, Ned unbuckled his sword belt and settled in for what brief rest he could snatch, half expecting nightmares to chase him. Morning dawned cold and drizzly. Sentries reported a quiet night. No major movement from Harrenhal or from Gregor's riders. That uneasy lull persisted for several days, as if both sides gathered strength. More lords arrived from the north. Small houses sworn to the Starks, bearing what meager forces they could muster now that the roads south were less harried. They brought tidings from Winterfell. Bran and Rickon were safe, though the Ironborn had been seen raiding up the stony shore. Balon Greyjoy scented weakness in the realm and might attempt another rebellion. Ned ground his teeth at that. Another front of war was the last thing he needed. Tyrion Lannister, meanwhile, found himself near the fringes of the conflict, traveling under the uncertain protection of a small band of Sellswords. After learning of Jaime's death, Tyrion had had no taste for solitude, yet no desire to throw himself at Tywin's feet and join the siege within Harrenhal. A part of him wanted to see his father's face, to glean some sense of how this war might end. Another part wanted to avoid Tywin altogether, for nothing was more terrifying than Tywin in mourning. Tyrion knew that if he appeared in the Lannister camp, Tywin might put him to use, or might discard him entirely if his presence offered no advantage. The gold of House Lannister was no guarantee of paternal love. He was also aware that Ned Stark had revealed the secret of Joffrey's parentage and claimed the throne was in the wrong hands. Tyrion had suspected the truth for years, that Jaime and Cersei's closeness was far more than sisterly affection, but he had never anticipated it would come to this cataclysm. Now it was open knowledge among the warring factions. Joffrey was not Robert's son. Tyrion could hardly guess how this would play out. If the rumors proved convincing, the entire realm might abandon the Boy King, unless fear of Tywin Lannister's vengeance stopped them. But with Jaime gone, Cersei's hold on Joffrey's regency was precarious. Tyrion pictured her, a mother lion robbed of her mate, lashing out at all sides. As the conflict raged, Cersei did indeed scramble to maintain control. Within King's Landing, chaos pulsed through every shadowed street. Royal decrees poured forth, commanding this or that levy from the Crownlands, but support wavered. The Gold Cloaks turned surly as more and more of their number deserted to avoid being sent to the front. King Joffrey's temper grew monstrous. He took to punishing any slight with a beating or worse. Late at night, the castle rang with the echoes of Cersei's furious tirades, sometimes matched by Joffrey's petulant screams. The small council, Grand Maester Pycelle, Lord Baelish, and Lord Varys, played a dangerous game of appeasement. None wanted the capital to become a battlefield. But with Tywin pinned at Harrenhal, Cersei lacked her father's direct might to enforce her will. She was forced to rely on the cunning of Littlefinger, the whispers of Varys, the half-hearted loyalty of men who saw which way the wind might blow. One crisp morning, Cersei's mood exploded in the throne room. Joffrey was holding a half-attended court session, hearing trifling disputes from lesser lords. The Boy King slouched on the Iron Throne, drumming his fingers on the cold steel. Cersei stood beside him, wearing a gown of deep green that did little to soften her severe beauty. The news had arrived that yet another load of grain wagons bound for King's Landing had been ambushed by brigands near the Rosby Road. Joffrey's eyes had flared with indignation, insisting these brigands must be the rabble loyal to Ned Stark. Cersei whispered in his ear, urging him to brand them outlaws and offer a lavish reward for their heads. Lord Varys coughed delicately. "Your Grace, the realm is awash in outlaws of all stripes. Some may serve the Starks, yes. Others simply smell the chaos and seize what they can. Offering a bounty could encourage more violence." "Are you questioning my order?" Joffrey snapped, voice shrill. His hand went to the crossbow he had begun carrying everywhere, like a child with a toy. "Don't forget, Spider. I could have you flayed if you displease me." Varys bowed low with a nervous smile. "I live to serve, Your Grace." Cersei lifted her head, eyes blazing. "This city is ours, and we will defend it. Any threat, be it brigand or rebel, must be dealt with. Proclaim a bounty if we must. We cannot appear weak." Lord Baelish made a show of examining his fingernails. "Strength is well and good, my queen, but coin is the surest path to loyalty. We might put out some gold, sweeten the pot for these brigands to reconsider their allegiances. Who knows? Perhaps we could buy them off." Cersei's gaze snapped to him. "A typical suggestion from you, Littlefinger, use gold. But I want them punished, not coddled." Baelish shrugged with feigned innocence. "Punish them, certainly, if we can find them. Gold might be the bait that draws them out." Cersei drew in a sharp breath, and for a moment, Joffrey glowered at both counselors. Then the Boy King laughed, a high, cruel sound that echoed through the throne room. "I'll hang them by their entrails, but first we'll pay them in coin, then we'll pay them in steel. Let them see what it means to mock the king." Cersei offered a tight smile. "That is a plan we can all agree upon." Then her expression darkened, and she lowered her voice so only the counselors near the throne could hear. Yet still no word from Father's camp. "The ravens that do arrive only bring talk of the siege. If Father cannot crush Ned Stark soon, all the realm may turn on us. Perhaps we should consider a wider net." She looked pointedly at Peter Baelish, who gave a slight nod of understanding. Varys licked his lips. "A net of secrets, or a net of gold, my queen?" "Both," Cersei said simply. "Find me allies, If the Tyrells remain neutral, see what it would take to bring them fully to the king's side. The Martells, too, though I doubt they'll forget old grievances easily. Do whatever you must, but if King's Landing stands alone and Father fails, we will be left at Stark's mercy." Her voice wavered, just slightly, and she clamped down on it with fury. "That is not acceptable." Joffrey, hearing only half of this, pouted like a child. "I don't need Tyrells or Martells. I have knights enough to kill that traitor Stark. When Father breaks free, we'll have Ned Stark's head." He fingered the crossbow as though imagining the shot. Cersei said nothing, but the tension in her posture betrayed the strain of her position. She too wanted Ned Stark's head. She wanted vengeance for Jaime above all else, but it was no longer a simple matter of ordering a head on a spike. The war had grown too large, swallowing the normal rules of engagement. The Iron Throne might soon lose all meaning if half the realm declared it illegitimate. In truth, some lords already whispered that Joffrey was no king and that Stannis Baratheon, Robert's brother, held the true claim. Others claimed Renly did, as the younger brother with more charm and, evidently, more lords flocking to his banner. The seeds of multiple claimants were being sown. If Tywin Lannister's intimidation no longer cast a broad enough shadow, House Lannister's hold on the throne would crack. It was enough to keep the Queen Regent pacing the corridors late into the night, frantic with grief and rage. Beyond the storm-lashed waters of Blackwater Bay, at Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon brooded in his ancient seat. Ravens had come bearing Ned Stark's allegations against Joffrey, along with rumors that the realm was on the brink of tearing itself apart. Stannis had always suspected something amiss about Cersei's brood, but had lacked proof, and had never loved King Robert enough to stir a scandal on guesswork. Now that Ned Stark's revelations were public knowledge, Stannis felt the weight of destiny on him. By all the laws of succession, if Joffrey was indeed a product of incest, then Stannis was the rightful king. Yet the realm had hardly rushed to his side. Some might have rallied if he offered them hope, but Stannis was no charismatic figure. His letters went largely unheeded. He had few friends in the Stormlands, overshadowed by Renly's easy charm. The lords who might have joined him balked at the rumors of the Red Woman, Melisandre, who now advised Stannis with her talk of the Lord of Light. Stannis brooded in the chamber of the painted table, glaring at the carved map of Westeros. Melisandre stood behind him, radiant in her red silks, a shimmering presence of confidence. "Your rightful seat awaits, my lord," she said in a voice as smooth as warm honey. "The Iron Throne calls for the lord chosen by Lawler. Darkness stirs in the north, old powers returning, but you must unite the realm beneath your banner first." He did not turn to face her. "I, the Iron Throne, but half the realm does not know or care that I am the rightful heir. My brother's so-called son sits in King's Landing with the Lannisters, while Ned Stark wages open war. The rest is splintered. Even if I raise my fleet and sail upon the capital, I risk the realm branding me just another usurper. And Renly, my own brother, courts favor with the Tyrells, apparently. He may declare himself king as well." Melisandre's ruby choker glimmered in the torchlight. "The Lord of Light's flames show me a path, my lord. A path of fire and blood, yes, but one that leads to your victory. You must act, claim what is yours. Let the unbelievers burn if they stand in your way." Stannis let out a bitter breath. "Easy words from you, woman. It is my men who will die if I gamble poorly. But I will not let the Lannisters remain unchallenged. Nor will I stand idly by as the Stark boy tries to name some other Baratheon. If they want the rightful king, I am here." Yet for the moment, Stannis delayed, uncertain how to break the deadlock of the war. The storms around Dragonstone had always been fierce, and the storms within Stannis's mind were fiercer still. He had to choose a moment to strike or risk irrelevance. In the Riverlands, that war raged on. Gregor Clegane's raids continued, forcing Robb and Ned to dispatch more outriders to protect farmsteads and supply wagons. Tywin remained pinned inside Harrenhal's black walls, but fresh rumors claimed he was methodically building siege weapons behind the fortress gates. Perhaps he meant to break out in grand fashion, smashing through the siege lines. Or perhaps it was a feint, The watchers from the Stark-Tully camps glimpsed new catapults on the battlements, and a towering device that looked like a massive ram. Even glimpsed from afar, it seemed monstrous, likely shaped to shatter gates or palisades. Ned suspected Tywin might attempt to force an assault from within, turning Harrenhal's walls into a trap. Daily, Ned faced calls from some northern lords to assault Harrenhal directly, to cut off the head of the snake. But Harrenhal was a fortress built on an impossible scale, and every story told that men who tried to take it by storm spilled their blood in rivers. The walls were as thick as city ramparts, the gates formidable, and the labyrinthine interior large enough to hide entire armies. A direct assault might well end in catastrophe. Winterfell's resources, combined with the Riverlords, might not be enough to breach those accursed walls without losing half their force. Ned and Robb insisted on patience, but impatience frayed at the edges of the camp. Meanwhile, autumn pressed on, with nights growing colder. During that lull, in a wide clearing near the fringes of the siege lines, the Stark soldiers drilled each day, seeking to keep discipline. Arya refused to remain idle. She joined the men in their morning practice, though they gave her only a light wooden sword. The Great John roared with laughter to see her whack at the ankles of a hapless squire, but Ned observed carefully, noticing the quickness of her footwork. When the men teased her, she only gritted her teeth and tried harder. Ned found it both endearing and heartbreaking. If the realm were at peace, Arya would be learning more ladle-like pursuits in Winterfell. Instead, she was forging a different path. He could only pray it did not consume her. One afternoon, as Arya sparred with a stable boy who had kindly agreed to be her partner, a horn blast echoed across the fields. 3 rising notes, a signal of approaching riders. Ned hurried to the vantage point near the forward barricades, heart pounding with each step. Scouts had been known to return with ill news. This time, though, what he saw was a party of riders bearing the Merman sigil of House Manderly. Relief washed through him. The Manderlys were strong allies from White Harbor, and if they had come in force, it meant more men and supplies to bolster the siege. Leading them was none other than Wyman Manderly's heir, Ser Wylis Manderly, a round-faced man but no less brave for his girth. He dismounted, kneeling briefly to Ned. "Lord Stark, your loyal vassals bring fresh provisions and men to the cause. My father sends his regards and regrets that he cannot join us in person." Ned extended his hand. "Your presence is more than welcome, Ser Wylis. I trust White Harbor remains secure." Ser Wylis nodded. "Aye, though there was talk of Ironborn raiders near our coasts. We repelled them easily enough. Father decided to commit more forces south, so here we are." He paused, glancing around. "It seems a bitter struggle you've found yourself in." Ned's lips pressed into a thin line. "We are at odds with a cunning foe, well supplied and dug in behind black walls." That was enough summary for the moment. Wylis would learn the details soon enough. Over the coming days, the Manderly reinforcements settled in, raising spirits and offering fresh bread and salted fish from their stores. Morale surged momentarily, buoyed by the sense that the North was still behind them. But with each day, new rumors circulated that Tywin might break out at night, that Gregor was burning more villages, that the king in King's Landing was threatening to name all of them traitors. War was a constant swirl of rumor and dread. Amid this turmoil, Sansa Stark, quartered in a secure rear encampment with Catelyn, found life lonely and disorienting. She was kept far from the front lines by her mother's insistence, but she still heard the horns, saw the columns of armed men marching, and felt the trembling fear that rose whenever new tidings arrived. She could scarcely believe this was the same world in which she'd once dreamed of wearing a princess's gown and marrying a golden prince. That dream had died the day her father executed Jaime Lannister and declared Joffrey's claim a lie. Yet Sansa could not forget those early, tender illusions of Joffrey. She vacillated between anger at him, knowing now that he was cruel and not a true Baratheon, and a wistful sadness for the storybook romance she had once cherished. At times she wept into her pillow at night, longing for the simpler days of Winterfell. Catelyn tried to comfort her, but the war pulled her mother in many directions, leaving Sansa to her own anxious thoughts. The other ladies in camp offered small consolations, but none understood how adrift she felt. She realized that she was no longer a child but could hardly claim to be a woman. In the swirl of war and blood, she felt lost. From time to time, she glimpsed her sister sneaking about the encampment, practicing with that little sword of hers. Sansa remembered when Arya had been an annoyance in King's Landing, always running off to chase cats. She wondered how the war was reshaping both of them, and whether they would recognize each other at the end of it. One bright morning, after a rare stretch of sunshine, the watchers on the eastern perimeter sounded their horns again. Ned, Robb, and several lords rushed to see what approached. Another contingent? Lannister raiders? To their surprise, a lone rider in battered armor appeared, bearing a tattered flag of truce. The rider was escorted into the Stark lines under heavy guard. It turned out to be a hedge knight, dust-caked and gaunt, with a sunburned face and hollow cheeks. He bore a message from Lord Tywin Lannister himself. Lord Bolton, ever quick. To sense a trap, questioned the man thoroughly. The knight trembled under the interrogation, insisting he had only come to deliver Tywin's terms. Finally, Ned took the sealed parchment and broke it open, eyes scanning the neat, curt lines penned in Tywin's hand. It was no offer of peace. Tywin demanded that Ned Stark and all his vassals withdraw from Harrenhal's vicinity and renounce any claims that Joffrey was illegitimate. If they did so, Lord Tywin would grant them pardon for the outrageous murder of Jaime Lannister and for the treasons committed against the crown. If they refused, Tywin vowed to break free of Harrenhal and lay waste to the Riverlands, then march on the north itself to exact vengeance. "He must be desperate," Robb muttered after Ned read the letter aloud to their council. "He wants us to fear him enough to abandon the siege. But we know he's pinned. He can't pass freely through the Trident unless we let him. If he were truly strong, he wouldn't propose any terms at all." Bolton ran a hand over his chin, his pale eyes thoughtful. "Desperate or not, Tywin's threats are not idle. If he breaks out, and he might if cunning permits, he will lay ruin to the Riverlands worse than before. The lords here have lost much already. They might be inclined to bargain rather than see their lands burn again." Catelyn, seated at Ned's side, interjected. "He offers pardons for murdering Jaime, yet makes no mention of the release of Sansa and Arya. He calls them traitors as well. Clearly, he means no genuine amnesty, only a trap." She exchanged a glance with Ned. They both knew that a Lannister's promise in wartime was thin armor indeed. Ned placed the parchment aside. "We hold. We reject his so-called terms, politely but firmly. Let the messenger see we are not afraid. Then we continue to close our net. Tywin must not slip away." The lords concurred. A curt refusal was penned and given to the hedge knight. The man left at once, nervous as a rabbit fleeing hounds, spurring his horse back toward Harrenhal's looming silhouette. That night, the watchers reported fresh activity on Harrenhal's walls, torches moving along the ramparts, the sound of men working at the gates. Everyone braced for some midnight sally, but none came. The fortress remained silent except for the flicker of lights. Bolton suspected Tywin was preparing for a breakout soon, perhaps building morale among his men. Or perhaps it was all a ruse, intended to keep the besiegers on edge. Days passed in tension, and then word came from scouts on the fringes. King's Landing had dispatched a small royal host, led by none other than the Hound Sandor Clegane. They were rumored to be heading west, possibly to break the siege or bring reinforcements to Tywin. But the Hound's party was modest, a fraction of what one would expect for a true relief force. Perhaps Cersei wanted to send help but lacked enough men in the capital to do so. Or perhaps the Hound had come for some other errand entirely, as unpredictable as the tides. Ned weighed the news. If they come, we can't allow them to unite with Tywin's men. But if we sally forth in large numbers to meet them, we risk opening a gap around Harrenhal. Robb agreed. We may have to rely on a smaller detachment to intercept Sandor Clegane's force, keep them from linking up. If they're truly only a small host, we can manage it. Bolton volunteered. I will lead a portion of our cavalry. The Dreadfort men can handle the Hound's rabble." His voice was calm, but there was a glint in his eye. Ned knew well that Roose Bolton could be dangerously effective, though his methods were often cruel. Still, they needed a capable commander to handle the threat. "Very well," Ned conceded. "Take enough riders to ensure victory, but not so many that we weaken ourselves here." Bolton departed the next morning, leading a few hundred horse and a contingent of seasoned foot soldiers. The watchers saw the columns wind away across the muddy roads, banners snapping in the breeze. The men left behind cast uneasy looks at Harrenhal, as though they feared Tywin would choose that exact moment to make his breakout. But the fortress remained silent. Possibly Tywin was watching with his own scouts, measuring the departing soldiers, biding his time. Meanwhile, Arya, bored by the stalemate, found mischief to occupy her curiosity. One evening, she slipped away from the main camp, creeping toward the old stables near Harrenhal's outer perimeter. She wanted a closer look at the black walls that had overshadowed their daily life for weeks. She clutched Needle in one hand, wearing breeches and a tunic. Her heart thudded with a heady mix of fear and excitement. It felt like a game, in a way a dangerous one, but she had grown used to the hush of looming battle. She made it as far as a ruined barnhouse that had been destroyed in the early skirmishes. Through the half-collapsed doorway, she could see Harrenhal's towers rising against the evening sky. Suddenly, a shape loomed from behind a broken beam. One of the sentries, a tall northern man with a grizzled beard. He seized her by the arm before she could dart away. "What are you doing out here, girl?" he hissed, eyes flicking left and right. "You want to get yourself shot by a Lannister arrow?" Arya glowered at him. "I'm no child. I can take care of myself. I'm Arya Stark. Release me." He recognized her name at once and let go, aghast. "My lady, forgive me, but these outskirts aren't safe. Scouts say Lannister skirmishers may be about. Your father would have my head if harm befell you." Arya's anger flared, but she swallowed it. "I was only looking. I can't stand being cooped up. You won't tell him, will you?" He looked pained. "I have to report any strange movement." "Your father's orders." Arya hissed in frustration. "Then do so. I don't care." But in truth, she did. She knew her father would lecture her severely about wandering so close to the fortress. Perhaps he would forbid her from drilling with the men. She didn't need to be caged further. The guard firmly escorted her back to camp, ignoring her protests. True to his word, he reported the incident to his commander, who promptly informed Ned Stark. Later that evening, Ned summoned Arya to his tent, wearing a stern look that made her squirm. He gestured for her to sit on a camp stool, while he stood, arms folded. "Arya," he said quietly, "do you have any idea the risk you took? If Lannister outriders caught you, or even some stray arrow..." He trailed off, exhaling slowly. "You must not do that again." She set her jaw. "I'm not a little girl anymore. I can fight. We're at war. Other men patrol near Harrenhal. Why can't I?" Ned's voice softened slightly. "War is not a game, Arya. Patrolling is for trained men who understand how to keep safe. You are brave, yes, but I won't risk you in foolhardy ventures. When we leave this place, I want both my daughters alive and well." Arya's eyes prickled with tears she refused to let fall. "I'm not going to hide forever." Ned placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know, child. One day you'll be a lady of a great house, or perhaps something else if you truly wish it. But for now, please trust me. Let me protect you." She swallowed hard, nodding once, though her frustration remained. Ned's gaze lingered on her face, seeing not just defiance but fear. War was forging her into something new. He recognized that she had courage, and it pained him to stifle it. But the front lines were no place for an untried girl, no matter how fierce. While the Starks managed internal tensions, a fresh wave of refugees poured in from the outlying hamlets. Thin, bedraggled folk, eyes hollow, reported that Gregor Clegane had sacked another village. These refugees carried their meager possessions and their terror. They prayed for Lord Stark to protect them, but the war had consumed everything. Many had lost families to the sword or the torch. In the gloom of the gathering dusk, Ned walked among them, giving what assurances he could. Robb arranged for the distribution of bread and salt, offering what kindness was possible. But it was never enough. When asked why Gregor was allowed to roam freely, Ned could only curse quietly. Tywin had unleashed the mountain as a terror tactic. If the Starks turned too many men to chase him, Harrenhal might break free. If they stayed in force, the mountain would keep ravaging. War seldom allowed neat solutions, so the refugees continued to pour in, some from Lannister outrages, others from lesser brigands who exploited the chaos. The Riverlands had become a wounded beast, flailing beneath contending wolves. At last, after countless false alarms, the Watchers sounded the cry that Harrenhal's gates were opening in force. It was a cold, bitter morning with fog clinging to the ground. Ned and Robb rushed to vantage points with their captains, scanning the fortress walls. Sure enough, the heavy gates had swung wide, and a host was emerging, banners visible through the haze. The Lion of Lannister. Siege towers rumbled forward, and from the ramparts, archers loosed arrows to cover the advance. Tywin had decided to break out. The horns blared across the Stark camp. Men scrambled to form ranks. Drummers sounded the call to arms. Ned struggled into his armor, wincing as the old wound in his side flared with pain. He had no time for caution. He mounted a horse, calling to his bannermen. Robb, likewise armed, took position on the left flank. They had anticipated Tywin might attempt to breach the siege lines somewhere near the main gate, which was the fortress's strongest exit. The plan was to hold him there, funnel him into a killing ground if possible. The morning gloom would be their greatest enemy, hiding Lannister movements. A roar of battle filled the air as the Lannisters surged forth. The ground trembled beneath the thunder of horses' hooves and the groan of massive siege engines. Crossbow bolts whistled overhead, slamming into Stark shields. Ned's men advanced in a shield wall, pikes bristling. In the swirling fog, shapes lunged at each other with steel. Shouts and screams mingled with the clang of blades. Ned found himself in the thick of it before long, spurring his horse to direct a group of archers to higher ground. He saw Lannister knights in gold-trimmed armor smashing into a line of Tully spearmen. Blood spattered the churned mud. Somewhere to the left, Robb's banner flew, the gray direwolf of Stark snarling in a sea of chaos. Trumpets signaled a cavalry charge, and Ned's heart clenched. This was precisely the type of swirling melee Tywin excelled at orchestrating. He might thrust from one angle, then pull back and strike from another. Harrenhal was behind him, but if he broke the siege lines, he could slip away and rally in open ground. "For the north!" bellowed the Great John, leading a wedge of burly men into the Lannister flank. They hacked and stabbed, driving the lions back step by step. But a fresh wave poured from the gates, led by a knight brandishing Tywin's personal standard, a golden lion on crimson. Men died screaming in the mud, horses reared and threw their riders. Ned urged his mount forward, ignoring the pain in his side, swinging ice down in an arc that cleaved a Lannister man-at-arms from shoulder to waist. Gore spattered Ned's armor, the warm spurt jolting him with grim reality. In the midst of this carnage, Tywin's tactic became clear. He had unleashed a diversionary thrust from the main gate while a second force emerged from a postern gate to the west, hoping to loop around and catch the besiegers in the flank. By the time the Stark outposts realized the danger, the second force was already upon them, mercilessly cutting through tents and supply lines. Chaos reigned. Robb spotted the encroaching threat and wheeled his cavalry to meet them. Clashes erupted near the western perimeter, tents blazing where pitch-soaked arrows fell. Ned glimpsed the glow of distant flames in the fog, realized with horror that the postern gate assault might unhinge their entire formation. If both Lannister forces linked up, Tywin could carve a corridor southward. Desperate to prevent it, Ned rallied the men near him, leading them into a breakneck charge across the churned field. They smashed into the side of the postern assault, surprising it from behind. For a moment, it seemed they would succeed. Lannister knights reeled under the sudden pressure, and a great cry arose from the Stark men. Ned cut down another foe, then a crossbowman. His horse screamed beneath him, struck by an arrow. He had to leap free, hitting the ground hard on his injured side. Pain lanced through him, momentarily dimming his vision. But he staggered up, raising ice just in time to deflect a sword blow from a Lannister foot soldier. A ragged swirl of combat raged around him. He heard Robb's voice, bellowing commands, though he could not see his son in the fog. He heard the Grachan's roar, the clang of steel. In the distance, a war horn brayed. The lines shifted again. The Lannisters near Ned began to fall back, spurred by some new impetus. At first, Ned wondered if it was a cunning feint, but then he realized the entire Lannister postern force was retreating. Across the field, near the main gate, the lion banners had begun to withdraw as well. Tywin had tested them, searching for a gap, but the siege lines, though battered, had not fully broken. Rather than commit to a suicidal push, Tywin was pulling back into Harrenhal's walls, stymied again. A ragged cheer went up among the northern men, though many lay dead or dying in the mud. Ned stood, breathing heavily, leaning on ice like a crutch. The black fortress doors slammed shut with a thunderous boom, leaving behind a field strewn with corpses and broken weapons. Robb appeared out of the dissipating fog, face grimy with soot and blood. He dismounted near Ned, clasping his father's arm. "Are you hurt? Just battered?" Ned managed, though his side felt as though it were on fire. "We held them off." He cast his gaze across the devastation. But at what cost? Men stumbled about, gathering the wounded, snuffing fires that had sprung from pitch arrows. The stink of burnt flesh and hair filled the air. If Tywin had hoped for a breakout, he had not achieved it. Yet he had inflicted heavy casualties. Already the moans of the dying underscored the hush of aftermath. Ned wanted to sink to his knees in despair, but forced himself to remain upright. The war was not done with him yet. That night, a storm rolled in, lashing the encampment with cold rain. The survivors were too exhausted to even curse the weather. Maesters and healers worked through the night, treating men with ghastly wounds, amputating limbs by flickering torchlight. Ned hovered near Robb in the command tent, both of them soaked to the bone. They studied the casualty lists. Over 200 men had died in the fighting, and many more were wounded. The Lannister toll was likely similar or higher, but Tywin could better afford losses if he still commanded more resources within those monstrous walls. "We can't keep bleeding like this," Robb murmured. "If Tywin tries another breakout, we'll be that much weaker each time. Unless we can force him into an open field and break his army decisively, he'll chip away at us until winter truly arrives." Ned nodded wearily. "I know. This can't go on forever." He remembered Robert's rebellion, how decisive battles had turned the tide. Here, there was no easy pivot, only a slow grind. "We could attempt a ruse, perhaps entice him into a trap. But Tywin is too cunning. He'll suspect anything obvious." From the shadows, Catelyn said quietly, "Word has come back from Roose Bolton. He met the Hound's force on the roads east. A skirmish took place, but the Hound retreated. Bolton suspects they were testing our perimeter." She clasped her hands together. "It seems all the Lannisters do is test us, searching for weakness." In truth, that was Tywin's hallmark approach. Methodical, ruthless, patient. He did not rely on sudden chaos alone. He wore down his enemies. Ned realized that the same was happening to their cause. The men were weary, battered, missing home. Sansa and Arya both risked heartbreak each day, living in a war camp. The river lords had lost crops and villages. Supplies were always a concern. If the war dragged on into the deep snows, the siege might become untenable. Yet Ned Stark's moral compass had not shifted. He had executed Jaime Lannister for the crimes he believed the Kingslayer had committed, and he refused to yield to a false king's rule. If that meant carrying this war to its bitter end, so be it. Honor was no halfway measure. He only prayed that by some grace of the gods, they might find a swift resolution. Across the realm, other storms gathered. In the Reach, Lords whispered that Renly Baratheon had married Marjorie Tyrell, forging a powerful alliance that would claim the Iron Throne for itself. Dorne watched with cold, unreadable eyes, still nursing old wounds from the time of Elia Martell's murder. The Vale remained half-closed behind Lisa Arryn's gates. The North had mustered almost every man it could spare. The Crownlands were a patchwork of uncertain loyalty. A great tempest of kings and claimants was forming, each poised to split the realm further. And in the far east, the Targaryen girl was said to be leading a Khalasar, or perhaps sailing with Sellswords, reports varied. For House Lannister, the driving impetus for war had once been to maintain their hold on the throne through Joffrey. Now it was vengeance for Jaime. Cersei festered in King's Landing, raging that Tywin had not delivered her Ned Stark's head. Joffrey continued his cruelty, tormenting any who dared question him, and threatening to march out himself if the men around him would not move. The word madness began to circulate among the commons, comparing him to the late Mad King. Though that was perhaps an exaggeration, it was enough to inspire more desertions and unrest in the capital. Peter Baelish and Varys worked feverishly to keep the city from tearing itself apart. Famine knocked on the gates, for autumn harvests had been decimated by war. Meanwhile, Tyrion Lannister, hearing of these developments, turned his steps southward, away from the direct carnage, seeking to find a vantage from which he might intervene or at least survive. The bitterness in his soul deepened with every rumor of Jaime's name. He considered whether to approach Robb Stark himself, to see if peace might be brokered. He knew Tywin would never negotiate personally, not over Jaime's memory. But if Tyrion could find a way to quell the storms, perhaps fewer Lannister men would die. Yet the idea of parley with Ned Stark, the man who had killed Tyrion's beloved brother, filled him with dread. For all that Tyrion understood about pride, he could not fully grasp the cold justice that had led Ned to that act. Even so, perhaps as a dwarf, he was uniquely suited to slip between giants and broker some resolution. The realm bled while the great lords hammered each other. Tyrion had no illusions that he could fix it single-handedly, but standing by idle seemed unconscionable. So the war ground on, day by day, beneath Harrenhal's walls and across the riverlands. Bloody skirmishes flared, claims rose in distant corners, and men whispered that the darkest storms were yet to come. The crisp bite in the air promised a colder turn soon. Talk of the snows drifting down from the north made many uneasy. If winter truly fell, armies might starve in place, or be forced to quarter themselves on the unfortunate small folk. Ned realized that if a harsh winter struck while they sat in stalemate, it might become a tragedy beyond counting. At Harrenhal, the next outbreak of violence came at dawn on a frigid day. Lannister riders, concealed by darkness, crept from a lesser sally port to burn part of the Stark supply wagons. The alarm sounded too late. By the time Ned's men arrived to drive them off, half of the wagons were aflame, thick black smoke billowing. The Lannisters vanished back behind their walls, leaving behind shrieks of wounded men and the smell of scorched grain. It was a crippling blow, though not mortal. The siege could continue, but the men would now face tighter rations. Afterward, Ned conferred with Robb and the other commanders. "We cannot let them bleed us day by day," Ned said, voice grim. "If we do not take decisive action, the men's resolve will falter." Robb nodded, tired lines etched into his features. "Agreed. But a headlong assault on Harrenhal? It's suicide." "Not necessarily," rumbled the great Jon. "If we pick the right spot, strike fast and hard, we could breach a section of wall. Harrenhal is monstrous, but not impervious. We do have some siege equipment." Bolton, who had returned from chasing the Hound's force, spoke in his quiet, unsettling way. "A breach is possible, yet Tywin will see it coming. He'll have traps laid, archers positioned. We'd be fighting on his terms, in the place of his choosing." Catelyn stood by, face set in worry. She had no taste for such a direct, bloody measure, but saw no better alternative. The war had forced them into a corner. A hush fell, broken by Ned's sigh. "We will weigh a plan to breach the walls. We must ensure it's done with cunning, if at all." possibly a feint at one section of the fortress while the main force hits another, or infiltration by smaller units to open a gate from within. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Harrenhal, with its haunted towers, was rumored to be near impossible to infiltrate unnoticed, but desperate times demanded desperate measures. Over the next week, the siege lines grew quiet again, each side knowing a storm was coming. Scouts reported that Tywin was reinforcing gatehouses, building new barricades. The War Council hammered out a plan of sorts, a nighttime approach by small teams to sabotage some portion of the outer defenses, followed by a broader push at dawn. It was a risk-laden strategy, but perhaps the only chance to avoid slow strangulation. During this tense preparation, the unthinkable happened. A sudden messenger arrived with news that Walder Frey had withdrawn a large portion of his men from the Stark lines. The old lord, typically cunning and opportunistic, had apparently grown wary of the siege's drawn-out nature. He was said to be opening negotiations with the Lannisters, likely to spare himself Tywin's wrath if the war turned against the Starks. The departure of those Frey soldiers meant a gap in the river crossings that had once been closely guarded. The Stark-Tully alliance reeled from this betrayal. Walder Frey had allowed them passage once, but now shifted with the changing tides. Ned muttered a curse upon the man. Robb's face grew stony with anger. The Freys had never been truly loyal, only self-serving. This development threatened to unravel everything. Without the Frey men, the perimeter around Harrenhal was weakened, and Tywin might find a corridor south if the crossing at the Twins was compromised. Furious ravens flew back and forth, scolding Walder Frey for his duplicity. The old man feigned that he was merely protecting his house, offering no clarity on whether he had truly allied with Tywin or merely pulled back to guard his own interests. But the message was clear. House Frey would no longer bleed for the Starks unless they saw certain advantage. Robb seethed in the aftermath. "We pinned our hopes on that old man's cooperation," he said, pacing. "He demanded I promise to wed one of his daughters. I've not had time to arrange that wedding, and now he punishes us for it." Ned set a hand on his son's shoulder. "We can't be held hostage by Walder Frey's whims. We must adapt." So they did, trying to seal the gap with other forces. But the blow was felt throughout the host. Confidence slipped further. The men began to question whether the war was winnable. Tywin must have crowed in satisfaction behind Harrenhal's black walls. At last, the fateful night came when Ned's infiltration teams attempted to sabotage a portion of the fortress's outer defenses. Men in dark cloaks crept through the gloom, guided by a few survivors from the region who claimed knowledge of hidden drains and water tunnels. Among them was a small group of skilled climbers from the north. The plan was to scale a neglected section of wall, slip inside, and set fire to the stables, or open a lesser gate for a vanguard. At best, they might cause enough panic to let the main Stark force break through at dawn. At worst, they might die to a man, leaving the fortress alerted. Ned did not join the infiltration personally. His wounded side still hampered him. Robb wanted to lead the infiltration group, but Ned forbade it. "Your life is too valuable to risk on a covert foray," he told his son. Instead, a seasoned captain named Jory Castle, an old Winterfell retainer, agreed to oversee the mission. With them went a handful of the best swords and stealthiest rangers, determined men prepared for a desperate gamble. Midnight came. The sky was clouded, offering precious little moonlight. Ned, Robb, and the rest of the War Council waited in tense silence at a forward command post, listening for the signal that the infiltration had succeeded. The plan was that once Jory's men opened a gate or created a diversion, horns would blow, and the main host would surge forward, hopefully overwhelming Harrenhal's defenders before Tywin could fully organize. They waited, hearts pounding. Minutes stretched into hours. The night deepened, silent save for an occasional hoot of an owl. The men grew restless. Then, near the second hour past midnight, shapes were spotted at the approach. A handful of men stumbled out of the darkness, Stark infiltrators, some wounded, some limping. No horns sounded. It was clear the attempt had failed. Ned rushed to meet them, fear knotting his gut. One soldier, barely able to stand, gasped out the tale. They had found the waterway half collapsed, discovered fresh guards posted at the wall. Traps had been laid. A few of them managed to kill the guards, but then more Lannisters arrived. The infiltration collapsed into a confused skirmish, and Jory Castle, along with many others, were missing, likely dead or captured. Ned reeled, grief and anger colliding. Jory had once served him faithfully at Winterfell, a loyal man. Another life devoured by this war. Robb's face was pale with fury. The infiltration had failed, Harrenhal was alerted, and Tywin would know now that the Starks contemplated a direct assault. The hopes for a swift infiltration had crumbled like dust. In the coming days, ravens from Harrenhal taunted the Starks with demands for ransom for Jory and any other captured men. Tywin likely wanted to sap their morale further. Ned refused to parley, refusing to yield to Tywin's terms. For all he knew, Jory was already dead. The war had grown bitterer still. Despair settled over the siege camp. Food grew scarcer, the nights colder. Men died of wounds, fever, or despair. The swirling rumors from the wider realm indicated that more claimants rose each day. Yet Ned Stark persisted, driven by unyielding conviction. Jaime's death had cast him in the role of Lannister Slayer, and the realm watched to see if he would break Tywin's power or be broken. One somber afternoon, as Ned stood by the ramparts they had constructed near the fortress approach, he spotted a familiar figure riding into camp. Catelyn, returning from a hasty visit to Riverrun. She dismounted swiftly, her face tight with fresh grief. Ned's heart pounded as he went to her. "What is it?" She clasped his hands. "My father, Hoster Tully, has passed on." Tears glistened in her eyes. "I was there in his final hours. He died in his bed, gently, praising the old times. He asked about you, about the children. I told him you still fought to save the Riverlands. He died proud." Ned pulled her into an embrace, sorrow swamping him. He had respected Hoster Tully, a father to Catelyn and Lisa, a man who had welcomed Ned as a son-in-law. Now the old lord was gone. "I am sorry," he whispered. "He was a good man." She sniffed, swallowing her tears. "He was. Brynden will serve as the guardian of Riverrun now, but with my father gone, our ties to some riverlords may waver. There are those who followed him out of love, and they might question continued loyalty in a drawn-out war. This is yet another blow." He pressed his forehead to hers. "We'll persevere. We must." But both knew the war had claimed another piece of their stability. Riverrun's leadership was in flux. The Tully banner still flew beside the direwolf, but men whose loyalty had been to Hoster personally might begin to falter. War tested every bond. An ache gnawed at Ned's soul as he surveyed the battered lines, the smoky horizon, and the towering black fortress of Harrenhal. So much loss, so many sacrifices, all begun that morning when ice had parted Jaime Lannister's head from his shoulders in the Red Keep's courtyard. He could not turn back time. He would not. His sense of justice demanded he see this through, even if the realm drowned in blood. But sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, he could not help but wonder if the realm might have been spared had he found another way. Then he would banish such doubts. Honor was harsh and unyielding, much like the winter winds of the north. The days that followed were full of woe. Yet in that bleakness, a faint thread of hope emerged. A band of scouts returned from the south with astonishing news. Stannis Baratheon had finally made his move. He had landed near Crackclaw Point with a fleet of ships, forging alliances among the lesser houses there who resented Lannister rule. The rumor stated that Stannis claimed the crown openly, proclaiming himself the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, denouncing Joffrey as an abomination. More significantly, the scouts believed that Stannis meant to march on King's Landing. If he threatened the capital, Cersei would have to send men to defend it. Tywin, pinned at Harrenhal, might be forced to choose between losing the capital or letting the Starks hold him in place. Ned absorbed this intelligence with grim satisfaction. He had no great love for Stannis, an austere, rigid man, but if Stannis's march split the Lannisters' attention, it could tip the balance. King's Landing might face a new siege. Cersei would be in a panic, Joffrey would likely rage, and Tywin might not be able to reinforce them from Harrenhal. That could force an end to the stalemate. The more the realm sees Joffrey's false claim, the more they may flock to Stannis, Ned mused aloud. His cause is lawful, at least in the eyes of those who believe in rightful succession. Robb frowned, running a hand through his auburn hair. Stannis is no friend to us. What if, once he seizes the capital, he declares all who warred without his leave to be traitors? That includes us. Ned nodded. We must be cautious, but the realm might be better served by Stannis on the throne than an incestuous usurper. Perhaps we can arrange an alliance if we clarify our reasons for fighting. In any case, this conflict grows beyond us. Tywin cannot ignore the threat to King's Landing forever. Word of Stannis's move caused ripples in the siege camp. Some men took heart, sensing that if the Lannisters were fighting a war on two fronts, victory might come sooner. Others worried that the new claim would overshadow the Starks, that Stannis might subjugate the entire realm by force of will. For the moment, Ned realized it was an opening. That opening came to fruition a fortnight later, when fresh ravens arrived bearing frantic pleas from the capital. The rumor claimed that Stannis had begun besieging King's Landing from the sea, blockading the harbor. Cersei demanded Tywin send men at once to break the blockade. Joffrey fumed, cursing his grandfather for failing to save them. The realm's main Lannister army remained stuck behind Harrenhal's formidable walls. Tywin, by all accounts, raged that he could not come to his daughter's aid while Ned's forces gripped him like a vice. Shortly thereafter, watchers atop makeshift wooden towers near Harrenhal reported seeing unusual movement. Lannister men seemed to be dismantling some of their siege engines, perhaps preparing to move them. Smoke rose from inside the courtyard. It looked as though Tywin might be planning a major push or a full evacuation. Suspense gripped the Stark camp. Was Tywin about to attempt one grand, desperate breakout? Or had he found a cunning route to slip away? Ned had sent repeated messages calling for more Riverlords to reinforce them, but with Hoster Tully's death, some houses were slow to respond. Others dreaded Tywin's vengeance if they were discovered. Still, a trickle of fresh troops arrived, enough to stiffen the lines. The men muttered about the big assault coming soon. Some prayed, some sharpened their blades. Sansa and Arya felt the tension, each in her own way. Sansa in fearful trembling, Arya in fierce excitement to see the Lannisters driven off. Even Catelyn, stoic as she tried to be, was racked with dread about what the next battle might bring. Then, without warning, a new force appeared on the horizon. Banners flapping green in the wind, the sigil of House Tyrell. For a moment, the entire siege camp stood stunned. Had the Tyrells come to rescue Tywin Lannister? That would be a crushing blow, for the might of Highgarden's armies was legendary. Yet the Watchers soon realized it was not a massive host, just a small embassy, led by Ser Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers. They bore no lion banner, only their own rose. Ser Loras approached under a flag of truce. Ned, Robb, and their guard met him in a neutral clearing, both sides bristling with caution. Ser Loras was known as a brilliant tourney knight, beautiful and proud, but how did he stand in this war? Rumors said his sister had married Renly Baratheon. If so, he might not care for the Lannisters at all. Ser Loras greeted Ned with polite formality, though his eyes flickered over the Stark men with clear wariness. Lord Eddard, we come in peace to speak of alliances. My Lord Father, Mace Tyrell, has thus far remained neutral, but events accelerate. Word has reached us that Stannis Baratheon besieges the city, and that Tywin Lannister is pinned here. Meanwhile, my sister's husband has declared himself king, forging a new claim in the south. The realm threatens to shatter. Perhaps it is time we speak plainly. Ned studied him. Speak plainly, then. Ser Loras took a measured breath. The Tyrells do not love the Lannisters, not after the manner in which Tywin turned on the Targaryens at the end of Robert's rebellion. Yet we will not submit to Stannis unless we must. My sister's marriage to Renly complicates matters. Renly claims the throne, but Stannis is older, more rightful by lineage. The Tyrells are uncertain whether to back Renly outright or wait to see how matters unfold. I have come here to gauge your intentions. If House Stark intends to see that false boy king dethroned, and if you would accept that Renly or possibly another Baratheon might rule, then perhaps we can find common cause. Ned weighed the words carefully. He had little appetite for seeing multiple Baratheons claiming the throne, but if House Tyrell turned against the Lannisters, it might prove decisive. We fight to end Joffrey's false claim, to avenge my friend Robert Baratheon, and to restore lawful rule. I wrote to both Stannis and Renly, urging them to unite, but they remain divided. We cannot force them. So yes, we will see Joffrey dethroned. If the lords of Westeros choose Renly or Stannis as king, House Stark will abide by that if it spares the realm more bloodshed. A flicker of relief crossed Ser Loras's face, though it was carefully schooled. Then we share a goal: the removal of the Lannisters from power. We do not come with a host today. My father remains cautious, and so does my king, Renly, as he styles himself. But if we can broker an understanding, we might march north in force to crush Tywin once and for all, or we might cut him off from the west. I can carry word back that House Stark is willing to see Renly crowned. Robb spoke up, frowning. But what of Stannis? He outranks Renly by birth. Ser Loras's voice took on a subtle edge. Stannis is a harsh man, with few allies and no love for Highgarden. Renly is more amiable, more open to alliances. We believe the realm would follow him more readily. The time for strict lineage might be overshadowed by the time for practicality. Ned could sense the swirl of politics behind every word. Yet alliances were the lifeblood of survival in war. We will not stand in your way if you choose to name Renly king, he said at last, so long as it hastens the end of Joffrey's false rule. But we ask that House Tyrell help us subdue Tywin Lannister and free the Riverlands from his grip. Ser Loras inclined his head. I can make no promises beyond delivering your stance to my Lord Father and my king. But if they see advantage, I suspect they will join you. The Lannisters have grown too bold, and if Renly is to rule, he cannot allow House Lannister to overshadow the throne. We will be in touch soon. Until then, we ask safe passage back south. Ned agreed, and so the Tyrell embassy departed. It left the Stark camp in a haze of new possibilities. If the Tyrells truly joined them, Harrenhal might fall by sheer weight of numbers. Yet it depended on Renly's approval and Mace Tyrell's appetite for war. The realm was fracturing in new ways by the day. While they awaited a Tyrell decision, the siege lines continued their watch. No further infiltration attempts were made. Tywin likely had tripled his sentries. Winter's breath touched the nights. Morning frost coated the grass outside Ned's tent. The men huddled around fires, rationing what little bread remained. Word came from the west that clans loyal to House Lannister were mustering near the Golden Tooth, possibly to attempt a relief of Harrenhal, but the roads were blocked by Tully outriders. Every day was a standoff that might shift in a heartbeat. Then, late in the evening of a wind-lashed night, horns blared suddenly from the northern perimeter. Guards shouted in alarm. Ned rushed out, sword belted, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side. Lightning split the sky, revealing vague shapes surging through the gloom. Could it be Tywin's men had found a secret route and circled around? Or a band of brigands? As Ned and a cluster of armed men approached the perimeter, they realized these newcomers carried no lion banner, nor any banner at all. They were half-starved small folk, stumbling in the mud, some with children clutched in their arms. On seeing the Stark soldiers, the refugees collapsed to their knees, pleading for mercy, claiming they had fled from further ravages by Gregor Clegane beyond the perimeter. The men let them pass, though confusion reigned. Ned heard their piteous tales. The mountain was still scouring the countryside for supplies or to sow terror, possibly under orders from Tywin or perhaps of his own savage volition. The refugees had slipped past his outriders, but many more had died or been dragged away. That was the tipping point for Robb. Seeing the wailing mothers, the children with hollow cheeks, he ground his teeth in fury. We have to stop Gregor, F.A. He said. If we allow this butchery to continue, what do our vows mean? Ned's face was grim. You speak truly, but we can spare few men if we're to maintain the siege. Then let me lead a swift force to hunt him, Robb demanded. "He can't have more than a few hundred men. We can trap him somewhere. At least we can end his raids." Ned weighed it. The moral imperative was strong, but it risked weakening the lines. Still, to ignore the mountain's atrocities chipped away at everything House Stark stood for. "Very well," Ned said at last. "Take a few hundred horse, no more. See if you can corner him before he returns to Harrenhal." Robb nodded, spurred by righteous anger. He took the Great John, some of the best riders, and set out under torchlight. Catelyn watched him go with dread in her eyes. It was reminiscent of the day he had marched from Winterfell, a boy becoming a commander. In Robb's absence, Ned prayed that Tywin would not sense the drop in numbers and try another grand push. Perhaps Tywin did not realize the Starks had dispatched a sizable portion of their cavalry, or perhaps he was still reeling from the news that King's Landing was besieged by Stannis. The next few days were tense but quiet, no major move from within Harrenhal. Then ravens arrived with contradictory rumors. Some said King's Landing had already fallen to Stannis, others that Joffrey had repelled him with wildfire along the Blackwater. No one knew the truth. The realm's chaos deepened, and each fresh rumor threatened to overturn strategic plans. While Ned grappled with these uncertain tidings, Robb's cavalry engaged Gregor Clegane's raiders near a ford of the Red Fork. Accounts later described a savage fight in the pre-dawn gloom, with the mountain lashing out in unstoppable fury, cutting down men left and right. Yet the Great John rallied the Northern Knights, enveloping Clegane's force on both flanks. Surrounded, the mountain's men tried to break through but were driven back by the Ring of Steel. Finally, Robb himself closed in on Gregor, clashing in a brief but brutal exchange. Gregor was wounded, badly enough that he roared like a wounded beast and spurred his horse away, escaping with a handful of survivors into the Riverlands wilds. Half his men lay dead, and the raids were effectively broken for the time being. Robb returned to camp victorious, though he had lost dozens of good men, and the Great John bore a nasty gash along his scalp. Word spread quickly that the young wolf had bested the mountain in open combat, albeit without slaying him. Morale rose again among the Stark host. Perhaps, they whispered, the tide was turning. Perhaps Tywin's terror was on the wane. In Ned's tent, Robb described the battle quietly, his hands still shaking from the intensity of facing Gregor. "He's a monster," Robb said, voice tight. "I thought I'd lost men before, but the way he cut through them, I'm just grateful we pinned him down in time." Ned clasped Robb's shoulder. "You did what had to be done, and you did it well." Robb closed his eyes. "I only wish we'd killed him. That beast will cause more misery if he lives." Ned sighed. "Likely so, but you saved many lives. That counts for something in a war as dark as this." He felt torn between pride and sorrow. Each victory was another step deeper into the labyrinth of death. Then, as if the gods themselves had arranged the final act, the Tyrell Raven arrived. Ser Loras had returned south, petitioned Renly and Mace Tyrell on House Stark's behalf. The letter read that the Tyrells had decided to support Renly's claim to the throne, that they would gather their banners at Bitterbridge and march north. Their aim was to drive out the Lannisters once and for all, dethrone Joffrey, and restore peace under King Renly. In exchange, they wanted House Stark's formal recognition of Renly as King of the Undulls and the First Men, plus certain concessions in trade. Debate broke out among the Stark and Tully lords. Should they throw their support behind Renly at the expense of Stannis? It might brand them oathbreakers in the eyes of strict succession laws. Yet if the Tyrells came in force, Harrenhal would be doomed, and Joffrey's hold on the throne would crumble. This was the clearest path to achieving the downfall of the Lannisters. Ned deliberated in private council with Robb, Catelyn, and trusted lords. Finally, he concluded that they could not spurn the Tyrell offer. The realm cried out for an end to war, and if Stannis and Renly insisted on splitting the Baratheon cause, the Starks had little choice but to ally with whichever side offered the swiftest blow against House Lannister. Honor might have demanded they support the elder brother, but practicality forced their hand. Thus, Ned dispatched a letter to Mace Tyrell and to Renly Baratheon, stating that House Stark would recognize Renly if he helped bring about the downfall of Joffrey and Tywin. The letter spelled out demands as well. The North would have greater autonomy in the future realm, the Riverlands would be compensated for the ravages inflicted, and certain lords such as Walder Frey must be dealt with. It was a bold set of conditions, but in war, negotiations must be made from a position of strength. Months of siege had hardened Ned's resolve. Jaime's death and the subsequent bloodshed had taught him that one must finish what one starts. If the Tyrells marched swiftly, Harrenhal could be cut off from the west, forcing Tywin to yield or face annihilation. With the capital threatened by Stannis, and a Tyrell host descending from the south, Tywin might be truly cornered. The final days of that bitter siege were marked by swirling rumors of the Tyrell host's approach. Scouts reported large columns crossing the Mander, mustering at Bitterbridge. Some said Renly himself was traveling with them, crowned and clad in green armor. Others claimed Mace Tyrell would lead, while Renly consolidated Stormland forces. The details varied, but the consistent fact was that a great southern army was on the move. Within Harrenhal, Tywin must have known the trap was closing. He launched no further major sorties, only occasional arrow volleys and small raids at night. One dawn, watchers glimpsed large columns of smoke rising within the fortress. Possibly Tywin was burning stores he could not transport. The Northmen readied themselves for one last assault or a sudden retreat by Tywin. For if he lingered much longer, the Tyrell banners would arrive to seal his doom. Then, on a gray morning heavy with low-hanging clouds, horns sounded from the southwestern edge of the horizon. Through the haze, Ned saw faint flickers of bright color. Green and gold, the sigils of Highgarden. A tremor ran through the Stark camp at the sight. The day they had long awaited had come. The Tyrell banners were here in force. At last, Ned Stark might see an end to Tywin's hold on Harrenhal. Men scrambled to defensive positions, uncertain if the Tyrells would truly join them in peace. But the lead riders carried open hands, wearing bright cloaks. A messenger galloped ahead, shouting that they came in alliance, that they wished to coordinate final measures against Tywin. Ned and Robb exchanged glances of mingled relief and caution. They had pinned their hopes on these Southerners. Could they trust them not to betray the North at the last instant for some private arrangement with the Lannisters? Tentatively, Ned formed a small party to greet the Tyrell host. He led it himself, despite the dull ache in his side. His battered armor still bore mud and stains from recent fights, while the Tyrell knights gleamed in polished plate, their cloaks embroidered with golden roses. The difference between a long, grueling siege and a fresh, well-supplied force was stark. Ser Loras Tyrell was at the head, looking slightly haggard from travel but nonetheless stately. Behind him came rows of knights bearing the banners of Highgarden, Brightwater Keep, and other vassals loyal to the Tyrells. Ned counted thousands, enough to tip the scale. Loras dismounted, bowing slightly. "Lord Eddard, we have come, as promised, to help finish this war." Ned inclined his head. "You come in time. Tywin still sits within Harrenhal. Together, we can ensure he does not escape." A new voice rose then, smooth and resonant. "We shall do just that." The speaker emerged from within the column. Renly Baratheon himself, clad in green velvet with a golden stag crown upon his brow. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and charismatic, flashing a winning smile. "Lord Stark, I am heartened to see you. I know you once served my brother Robert, but I trust you will find me a suitable king." Ned offered a cautious bow. "Your Grace, if it brings the realm peace, I have sworn to uphold your crown rather than watch a false king rule. We face a formidable foe here." Renly's eyes sparkled with confidence. "Formidable, perhaps, but not unstoppable. We'll cut off his escape routes. He'll be forced to fight or surrender. With our combined strength, Tywin cannot stand." Thus began the final cordon around Harrenhal. The Tyrell forces established camps along the southwestern approach, linking up with the Stark lines. Communication was swift. Plans were made to tighten the siege to an iron ring. At last, Tywin's hold on Harrenhal was truly compromised. All that remained was to see if the old lion would attempt a furious breakout or yield to the tide. Inside Harrenhal, watchers on the walls must have seen the swelling ranks of Tyrell and Stark banners. By the second evening, plumes of smoke rose anew from within the fortress. The next day dawned eerily silent. No arrow volleys or catapult shots from the walls. Nervous anticipation gripped the besiegers. Then, near midday, a gate opened, and a small retinue rode out under a white flag. At its head, recognized even from afar, was Tywin Lannister himself, clad in gilded plate, posture rigid as a drawn bowstring. Ned and Renly mustered their best knights to meet him in the open field, well away from archers on the walls. Tywin's face was a mask of cold rage. His lines were etched deeper than before, and his hair shone white gold in the sun. Ser Loras, Robb Stark, and other lords formed an honor guard. Tension hung thick. Had Tywin come to surrender or to parley? He reined his horse to a stop, letting his imperious gaze sweep the gathered foes. He did not tremble or plead. That was not Tywin's way. When he spoke, his voice was measured. "You have me surrounded, it seems. Though I might fight to the last, the realm would only bleed further. My men are exhausted, outnumbered, harried by illusions of loyalty. I will consider terms." Renly flicked a glance at Ned. Then he addressed Tywin in a ringing voice. "Your king, Joffrey, is a bastard born of incest. You hold no rightful claim to that throne, and you stand accused of high treason against the realm. If you surrender your arms, disband your forces, and recognize me as king, we may show mercy. But you and your house must answer for your crimes." Tywin's eyes gleamed with hatred. He looked at Ned. "You killed my son, Stark. There is no reparation that will undo that." He spat the words like venom. "But if it spares what remains of House Lannister, I will withdraw my claim. Joffrey can face your trials if you so insist. My men will lay down arms." His expression turned mocking. "Yet do not expect me to kneel." A hush followed. Ned heard the subtle catch in Tywin's voice at the mention of Jaime. The old lion's pride was battered, but not broken. Renly pressed. "You will kneel to your king, my lord, if you value your life." Tywin said nothing. He kept his gaze fixed on Ned. Then, with an icy calm, he removed his sword belt and let it fall to the ground in a muted clatter. It was as close to a surrender as Tywin Lannister could bring himself to show. Behind him, the men in his retinue followed suit. Ned suppressed a tremor. Was it truly over? No single moment could restore the realm's wounds, but the sight of Tywin Lannister casting down his sword belt felt like a turning point. Jaime's father, the terror of the Westerlands, was disarming before them, forced to accept defeat by the might of the combined Stark-Tyrell host and the threat of Stannis at the capital. The war that had begun with Jaime's execution might be nearing its end, though the consequences would ripple for years. Renly gestured, and knights stepped forward to take Tywin and his retinue into custody. Warily, the watchers waited to see if it was some trick. But Tywin's men inside Harrenhal followed suit when word came that their lord had yielded. Gates creaked open, and Lannister soldiers trudged out, some weeping with relief, others glaring in defiance. Harrenhal, that cursed fortress, at last passed from Lannister hands. Ned breathed unsteady air. A swirl of emotion threatened to overwhelm him. He had begun this war with a single stroke, executing Jaime for treason. Now that father's pride had been brought low, the Lannisters' stranglehold was broken. Yet the realm was not truly at peace. King's Landing might be in chaos, Stannis might press his claim, and Renly might not hold the throne uncontested. But for this one moment, Ned allowed himself the smallest measure of relief. The lion was defanged, at least here. His eyes found Tywin's grim face. Tywin did not beg for mercy, nor did Ned expect him to. Perhaps this was only a pause in the cycle of vengeance. The realm's memory was long, and the name Lannister commanded fear and envy. But the wave of war had broken upon Harrenhal's walls, leaving Tywin forced to surrender. Jaime's ghost lingered in the air, a phantom of the deed that had sparked all of this. As the day wore on, the new victors, Stark, Tully, Tyrell, secured Harrenhal. The proud banner of House Lannister was torn down from the ramparts, replaced by the dire wolf, the trout, and the golden rose. Renly's golden stag soon joined them, signifying his claim as king. Hostages were taken, gates locked, and Tywin himself was escorted under heavy guard to a provisional tower cell. Ned oversaw the arrangements soberly, giving strict orders that prisoners were to be treated with dignity. There would be no butchery or rapine. They were not the Lannisters. At day's end, Ned stood in the ruined courtyard, gazing up at the charred towers. Robb joined him, likewise subdued. "It's done," Robb said softly. "We have Tywin in chains. He'll face justice, as he should, for unleashing war upon us." Ned nodded, though he knew justice was seldom simple in the Game of Thrones. The realm still needs healing. Joffrey remains in the capital, if he's even still on the throne. Stannis stands outside King's Landing, and Renly claims the crown from here. More blood may yet be spilled. Robb's shoulders slumped slightly. So many died under these walls. "Do you think it was all worth it, father?" Ned closed his eyes, the memory of Jaime's severed head flickering in his mind. When a man sets out to do what he believes is right, he must endure the consequences, no matter how heavy they weigh. The realm deserved the truth. Robert Baratheon was my friend, and I could not stand by while a false heir and those who conspired to seat him tore the land apart. Whether it was worth it, only the gods know. But I stand by my choice. My only wish is that fewer innocents had paid the price. Robb reached out, clasping his father's forearm in a gesture of mutual support. "We'll see this through, then. We'll rebuild the Riverlands, secure the north. We'll ensure the truth prevails." Thunder rumbled in the distant sky, as if the heavens themselves registered the gravity of the moment. Eddard Stark felt the cold wind on his face and wondered what the dawn would bring. War had taken them to the darkest depths of horror, pitting honor against cunning, justice against vengeance. He had swung his sword and begun a fire that consumed thousands. Now, at least one phase of the conflict had ended. The Lannisters' iron grip was broken at Harrenhal. Beyond these walls, the realm still trembled, fracturing among rival kings. The future stretched uncertain before them. Yet for Ned, the path was the same as it had always been: to place duty and honor above fear, to protect his family, and to do what he believed was right, no matter the cost. He stood there a moment longer with Robb by his side, listening to the echoes of men calling orders, the rattle of chains as Tywin Lannister was escorted deeper into the fortress. Above, the moon slid from behind clouds, casting a pale glow on the scorched stone. A new chapter of strife would begin with the morn, but for now, Eddard Stark allowed himself a single breath of relief amid the rubble. Jaime's death had ignited a war of fire and blood. Now, the war's shape would shift again as the Starks and Tyrells turned their gaze toward the Iron Throne. And the question lingered, unspoken in the night air. Had Ned's honor saved the realm from a deeper lie, or plunged it into a cycle of endless war? Perhaps the answer would come when the next dawn arrived, and with it, a realm forever changed by the fall of House Lannister's golden scion under the swing of ice.